Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the American Wild West, a place where the wind howled like it had a personal grudge against you, and winters weren't just cold, they were absolutely savage. This is the frontier, where your options for staying alive boil down to a few critical questions. Can you find shelter? Can you make fire? And can you build something, anything that doesn't collapse before morning? You probably won't survive this, to be honest, but lucky for you, this is a relaxing history channel. You'll make it through the night, barely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where and when people are listening. Are you wrapped in blankets in Boise at 11:42 PM, or making soup in Sydney at 2 in the afternoon? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the middle of a wide, frozen plain. Snow crunches under your worn boots with each step. There's a silence here, thick, heavy, the kind that settles on your shoulders like a second coat. The sky is steel grey, and the horizon stretches out in every direction like someone forgot to add borders to the map. Welcome to winter in the Wild West. There's no warm inn nearby, no bustling town square, just raw land, brutal weather, and whatever you can build with your two calloused hands. You tug your coat tighter, thin wool, patched at the elbows, already soaked through at the seams. The wind slices through it like a knife through paper. If you don't get some kind of shelter up by nightfall, well, you'll be the latest cautionary tale, buried beneath a snowdrift by morning. You scan the landscape for signs of possibility, trees, rocks, a hill you could dig into maybe, anything to break the wind. You're not alone in this challenge. Thousands before you made this same gamble, trading comfort and safety for a shot at land, freedom or gold. And now it's your turn to solve a puzzle the West throws at every living thing: how to survive when winter hits harder than a runaway wagon. This first wave of settlers, whether they were homesteaders, cowboys, miners or wanderers with nothing left to lose, quickly learned that nature plays dirty. Temperatures in places like Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota territories could plunge well below zero and stay there for weeks. Snowdrifts swallowed fences, winds pried open badly built doors, and roofs collapsed under the sheer weight of ice and regret. There was no blueprint, no standard issue instruction manual for how to not die in a field of snow. Everyone figured it out on the fly. Some succeeded, some, well, left behind eerie frozen boot prints and a warning to others. In the early days, one of the first shelter options was nothing. Yep, nothing. If you were a wagon traveller caught by surprise, you might try huddling under the wagon, wrapping yourself in every blanket you owned and praying the horses didn't bolt. It wasn't a good plan, it barely qualified as a plan. But when the wind hits and daylight vanishes in minutes, even a wooden wheel offers comfort. But let's say you've got a little more time than that. You've scouted the land, you've staked your claim, and now you've got maybe 6 weeks before the real cold sets in. That's your window to build. The question is, what? Some settlers went with the log cabin, if trees were around. Others dug into the earth itself, creating homes half above ground and half beneath it. These dugouts were warmer than you'd think. Being underground insulated you from the wind and evened out the temperature swings. It wasn't glamorous, mud walls, dripping ceilings, but it kept you breathing. There's also the issue of firewood. You can't just heat a shelter, you have to keep heating it. Every single night. That means chopping cords of wood, stacking it high, and hoping it doesn't get soaked under snow. The more firewood, the better. It wasn't uncommon to see entire families go into firewood panic mode come fall, chopping like their lives depended on it. Because, well, they did. Quirky fact time. In some parts of the plains, settlers got so desperate for fuel they burned dried buffalo dung. It was lovingly nicknamed buffalo chips, and yes, it smelled exactly as you'd expect when tossed into a fire. But it burned surprisingly well, and was often the only option in treeless expanses. People got very used to the scent of prairie perfume wafting through the house. Now here's the kicker, not everyone agrees on who had it worst. Was it the farmers in the wind-ripped plains with nothing but flat earth for miles? Or was it the mountain folk snowed in so deep they had to tunnel out of their homes each morning? Scholars still debate which region pushed human survival further. The prairie left you exposed, the mountains buried you alive. Pick your poison. But wherever you were, winter demanded everything. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about water. You had to melt snow or crack through frozen creeks to drink. It was about food, not just storing it, but making sure it didn't freeze solid in your root cellar. Even simple tasks like getting dressed or going outside to use the privy became trials of endurance. At night you huddled beneath itchy wool blankets, every breath fogging in the air above your face. You didn't just hope the fire would last, you begged it to. If it went out, you might not wake up. It's no wonder so many frontier letters include casual notes like, "Lost 2 toes this winter," or "Lucy's hair froze to the wall again." Still, there was a certain poetry to it too, a harsh kind of beauty. The stars were absurdly bright on clear nights. The snow glowed blue under moonlight. Inside the cabin or dugout, lanterns cast golden light on rough-hewn walls, and the crackle of the fire was the only sound for miles. Survival was hard, but those who made it through could never quite forget that strange, quiet magic. And so, your first night in the Wild West is closing in. You've spotted a rocky ridge nearby, a place to tuck in, maybe start digging. The sun dips low, the wind is picking up again, your fingers are numb, your breath a cloud. It's time to build or freeze. You press your palms into the frozen dirt and start to dig. You're about halfway through digging when your shovel hits something solid. Earth packed so hard it might as well be stone. You stop for a second, panting, the cold stinging your lungs like little knives. Your coat is wet from sweat and snow, and the wind has found its way down the back of your neck again, whispering unpleasant promises. The sun is dipping fast and you've barely got a hole deep enough to sit in, let alone sleep. So, you pivot, literally. You turn and scan for another option, and that's when you see it. Grass. Not just any grass, but long, thick prairie sod clumped over the edge of a rise. Sod, dirt, roots. A material so wildly unglamorous, yet so oddly reliable it practically screams desperate frontier ingenuity. Welcome to the humble world of sod homes. You drag your aching legs over to the rise and tear a chunk free. It comes up in one thick, squishy sheet. Grass on top, a tangled mass of roots and soil underneath. You pull another, and another. Before long you're stacking them like oddly shaped bricks, trying to form a windbreak. Then maybe, if you can last the evening, a tiny shelter. This is the way of the prairie. Out here, trees are a luxury. In some parts of Kansas or Nebraska, you could walk for days without seeing a single one. And without trees there's no lumber, no planks, no neat little log cabins with rocking chairs and smoke curling out the chimney. There's just you, your shovel, and the carpet of tough, root-bound earth that you're now turning into a makeshift house. You keep stacking. The sod is heavy, almost soggy in your hands, but it holds together like a dream, thanks to all those deeply matted roots. The pioneers called them Nebraska bricks, and honestly, they weren't far off. Sod blocks were often cut into sizes about 2 feet long and 6 inches thick, manageable enough to stack like giant brownies of filth. The roots interwove into the neighbouring blocks, and over time they hardened, sealing into surprisingly strong walls. Now don't get too excited. These houses weren't cosy in the way you might imagine. They were muddy, damp, and prone to dropping the occasional clump of ceiling dirt onto your stew. Rain leaked through, bugs moved in uninvited, and during especially wet winters the walls could literally melt into the ground. But they were warm. Earth is a powerful insulator, especially when snow piles up against the outside. The temperature inside stayed just high enough to keep you from freezing, and that, out here, is what counts. You step back and look at your creation. It's barely more than a mound with a hole in it, but it's something. You've even managed to wedge a chunk of canvas over the top for a roof. It's not pretty, it's not even straight. But the wind is already quieter inside and you're not dead yet, which feels like a huge win. Some settlers built entire family homes this way. We're talking 4 walls, a thatched roof made of more sod or brush, and maybe a stovepipe poking out the top. They'd build these soddies right into the ground, half buried for extra protection. The floors were often just dirt. The windows, if there were any, might be animal hide stretched over a hole, or in fancier homes, panes of glass carted in from the east, wrapped in flour sacks and hope. Oddly enough, some people came to love their sod homes. They stayed warm in winter, stayed cool in summer, and were so soundproof you couldn't hear a blizzard screaming outside. And while they definitely had problems, snakes sometimes dropped from the ceiling for example, They also represented the wild spirit of improvisation that defined the frontier. Here's a weird little historical tidbit. Some sod houses had grass growing on the roof. Yep, settlers would pack sod so tightly on top that roots would re-sprout, and soon you had a living roof, one you might even need to mow come spring. Talk about curb appeal. But there's debate over just how widespread sod homes really were. Some historians argue they were more common in story than in practice, with fewer families actually choosing to live in them long term. Others point out the sheer number of photographs and written accounts that prove sod was often the only building material available. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. People used whatever they had, and for a lot of folks what they had was dirt. As night begins to fall, you light a small fire just outside the mouth of your shelter. There's no chimney yet. You haven't earned that level of architectural dignity, but you can nestle close and let the flames lick at the edge of your numb hands. The fire hisses, spitting up sparks that vanish into the cold air. You hold your hands above it, grateful, even as your boots stiffen with frost. Behind you, the sod walls press in, silent, damp, strangely reassuring. You've survived the first step, shelter. Tomorrow will bring a new set of problems. You'll need to figure out water, food, more fuel, maybe a way to seal off the roof more permanently. You'll probably wake up stiff and coughing, your hair tangled with dirt and the taste of smoke in your mouth, but still, you'll wake up. Somewhere out there, other pioneers are doing the same, building with dirt, shivering, swearing, surviving. The winter's just begun, and so has the fight to outlast it. For now, you press your back against the sod wall, wrap your coat tighter, and close your eyes as the fire crackles beside you. The stars wheel overhead, the wind howls, and your little patch of dirt becomes a fortress against the frozen night. By the time dawn finally bleeds across the horizon, your fire has dwindled to a sad pile of grey coals, and your legs have long since stopped responding like they belong to you. You crack open one eye and immediately regret it. The light bouncing off the snow is harsh, sterile, and utterly unforgiving. But you're alive, and that counts for something. You made it through a prairie night inside a patchwork shelter made of frozen dirt, roots, and a whole lot of last-minute decision-making. Congratulations, you're now officially in the same club as thousands of 19th century settlers who managed to build a shelter with nothing but guts, and whatever the ground gave them. But let's say you didn't land in the middle of flat, treeless plains. Maybe your wagon veered a little west, into the rougher terrain of the Rockies, or the timber-rich forests of Oregon. Now, things are different. The cold still bites just as hard, but you've got something the prairie folks would trade their last pair of wool socks for. Trees. And with trees come the granddaddy of all frontier dwellings, the log cabin. Now hold up. Before you start picturing Lincoln logs and cozy hearths, let's reset expectations. Building a cabin on the frontier wasn't cute. It wasn't romantic. It was hard labour with a side of splinters and frostbite. And you? You've just decided that it's your next move. Step one is choosing the right trees. Not just any will do. You want straight tall ones. Pine, cedar, spruce, whatever's local and won't rot the second it gets damp. Then comes the real joy. Chopping. There's a reason lumberjacks had biceps like coiled rope. You swing your axe again and again, feeling the vibration up your arms with each crack. The sound is satisfying in a way that cuts through the cold. Wood on wood. Progress. One tree down. Now repeat. 10, 20, 30 times. Once you've got enough logs, it's time to haul them, not roll, not drag, but haul, across uneven, snow-packed terrain. If you're lucky, you've got a mule or two. If not, well, you've got your own back, and whatever muscles you haven't frozen off yet, you start stacking, notching the ends so they interlock like an X. No nails, no metal, just wood fitting into wood, sealed with mud, moss, or if you're feeling fancy, homemade mortar from clay and sand. This is your cabin's skeleton. Thick log walls that start to take shape with each layer. It's slow going, especially when your fingers keep going numb and the snow creeps into your boots. But the cabin slowly rises around you like something half remembered from a childhood storybook, only colder and muddier, and filled with small disappointments, like when you realise the door frame you cut leans to the left and the roof is going to be a challenge. Now, for the roof. There's an entire philosophical debate on how best to roof a log cabin in the winter, and none of the answers are particularly satisfying. Some folks use overlapping slabs of bark, others carve rough wooden shingles by hand. A few cheat and throw a canvas tarp over it, praying the wind doesn't catch it like a sail and launch the whole thing into the next county. Whatever you choose, just know it will leak. Probably while you're asleep, probably right onto your face. Despite all this, a log cabin has real advantages. It breathes warmth, holds up well in heavy snow, and actually becomes stronger as the logs settle and dry. The thick wood acts like natural insulation, especially when the cracks are stuffed full of chinking, a glorious mix of whatever you have lying around. Mud, grass, horsehair, even bits of worn-out clothes. Frontier families were masters of making do. One classic example. To hang a door, they'd whittle wooden pegs and hinges right out of the surrounding forest. No hardware store needed, just you, a knife, and a deep desire to not get eaten by wolves while sleeping. Quirky fact. In some cabins, the floor wasn't even added until spring. People just lived on bare earth for months. Sometimes they'd throw down hay or pine needles to soften the blow. Kids ran around in moccasins or just thick socks, and yes, frost formed inside the cabin on particularly rough nights. But compared to freezing to death in the open, this was the Ritz. Cabins also came with an invisible bonus feature: psychological shelter. Being surrounded by walls, actual walls, changed how people survived mentally. The four solid corners of a cabin gave families something to cling to during the long, soul-chewing winters. A roof meant safety, a door meant privacy. Even if the wind still shrieked outside like a banshee on a bad day, the cabin made you feel like you had a fighting chance. But here's where historians still raise their eyebrows. Just how common were these fully formed, sturdy log cabins during the first few years of settlement? Some argue that most early shelters were temporary. Lean-tos, half-finished huts, maybe just a wall or two covered with a hide. Others believe settlers were quick to upgrade, eager to create permanent homes even while battling winter head-on. The truth is, survival demanded speed, but pride demanded walls, and people built whatever their time, tools, and energy allowed. By the time you finish your own log structure, if you can call it that, you're exhausted. Your knuckles are raw, your clothes smell like sap and smoke, but the walls are upright, the roof is mostly waterproof, and you've even rigged a crude chimney out of stacked stones and leftover clay. You sit down in the corner as the first snow of the evening begins to fall again. It's quiet in that thick, muffled way snow makes everything feel. You can hear the faint crackle of your new fire, see its reflection in the chinked walls, smell the slightly burnt scent of sap and old pine needles. Your bed tonight? A pile of hay under an old quilt, and somehow it feels like a triumph. The cabin creaks as it settles. The wind sighs against the logs, and for the first time since the journey began, you start to feel, if not warm, at least sheltered. You wake to the sound of wind scratching against wood like a claw. It's that thin, icy kind of wind that somehow squeezes itself through every gap, no matter how carefully you chink the logs. You pull the quilt up over your nose, feeling your breath fog against the fabric. Your toes? Still frozen. Your back? Still sore. But your walls are standing. The fire's still burning low. You're starting to believe this whole not dying thing might actually work out. You shuffle outside to relieve yourself. No indoor plumbing here, just a crusty patch of snow and a deep sense of personal regret. Then you take stock of your situation. You've got your walls, you've got your roof, but you've got a problem most folks don't consider until they're already shivering inside it. The ground is winning. Cold seeps in from below like a creeping curse, and you realise what many settlers learned too late. You're going to need better insulation. But before insulation, before even firewood or food storage, there was a shelter type so humble and so strange, it was practically part cave, part fever dream: the dugout. If the cabin was a statement of defiance, the dugout was a whispered compromise. Fine, I won't stand above the land, I'll hide inside it instead. And for a lot of people, that worked just fine. Picture this. You find a hillside, maybe it's facing south to catch more light, and you start digging. Not with fancy tools, but with whatever's available. Shovels, axes, broken pickheads, even your own hands if that's all you've got. You carve a hole straight into the slope, scraping out a rectangle big enough for you, your partner, your children, maybe the dog, and hopefully some belongings that don't smell like kerosene and disappointment. The roof? Usually made of logs, brush or sod laid over a rough timber frame. The entrance might be just a gap in the hillside, or if you're really getting clever, an actual door. The floor is dirt. The walls are dirt. The ceiling rains dirt whenever someone walks too loudly above. But you know what? It's warm. Warm enough. The beauty of the dugout is its simplicity. Earth maintains a more stable internal temperature than the air outside. So while the wind rages and snow piles up above, inside your little cave it stays just below freezing, or if you've got a fire going, downright tolerable. You're not thriving, but you're not shivering to death in your sleep either. And get this, some of these dugouts weren't temporary at all. Entire families lived in them for years. Some dug them deeper and added side rooms. Others plastered the inside walls with mud or whitewashed them with lime to keep the bugs out and reflect what little light there was. There are even records of school teachers and storekeepers setting up shop in dugouts until towns could afford real buildings. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. One quirky frontier record tells of a family who lived in a dugout so small they slept head to foot like puzzle pieces. When it snowed heavily, they'd wake up to find the chimney buried and have to take turns digging their way out like prairie moles. Another settler claimed her dugout got so damp the walls grew mushrooms, free food and fungus. Luxury. Of course, not everyone agreed on the merits of subterranean living. Some saw it as a mark of shame, a symbol of failure to conquer the land in a proper upright fashion. Others considered it the smart move, a way to outwit winter using the planet's own insulation. Historians still debate whether dugouts were a last resort or a first-choice strategy, and the answer probably depends on who you ask, and how many winters they survived. But let's rewind. Imagine yourself now, about to carve a life into a hillside. You've got your tools, you've found your slope. As you dig, the sun starts dipping, and the temperature drops so fast your breath becomes a steady fog. But the deeper you go, the quieter it gets. The wind fades, the snow muffles. You hollow out a space just wide enough to sit down inside, then widen it, deepen it, and start imagining how it could become home. You pack the walls as tight as you can, lay a tarp or old canvas across the top, and stack sod and sticks to weigh it down. Then, with fingers aching from cold and grime under your nails, you light your fire. The first breath of smoke curls up and out through the crude chimney, and for a moment the world smells like hope. Inside you arrange your few possessions, blankets, a pot, maybe a Bible or a journal. You curl up in the corner, pressed against the earth, and feel the warmth creep back into your limbs. The roof creaks, a few flecks of dirt drop onto your hair, but you're in, and that means everything. Dugouts were far from glamorous, but for thousands of settlers, they were the difference between life and death. The ground gave them shelter, it absorbed sound, it held warmth, and unlike logs or milled lumber, it didn't cost a dime. In a place where every breath came with a price, that kind of savings was priceless. By spring, some people abandoned their dugouts in favour of cabins. Others stayed put and improved them, adding sod walls around the front for structure, or carving steps into the interior. A few even added windows, holes covered in waxed paper to let in light without letting in wind. Still more just walked away, their temporary homes eventually swallowed by grass and time. But if you're in your dugout right now, if you're huddled in the earth with a fire flickering and the cold held at bay by sheer determination, and a 6-foot wall of dirt, you're not going anywhere. Not tonight. Outside, the snow begins again, soft as whispers. Inside, you press a hand against the cool, damp wall and close your eyes. The land, for once, is holding you instead of testing you. The fire in your dugout sputters and pops as another night rolls over the plains, thick with silence and ice. You lie curled in a cocoon of every blanket, coat and burlap sack you own, and still the cold presses in, slow and steady, like water seeping through a crack. But then, you remember the golden rule of survival out here. Don't just build shelter, heat it, somehow, constantly, and without burning the whole place down in the process. Fire is the soul of a winter shelter. Without it, you're just slowly freezing in a decorative wooden box. But out here, where everything is improvised, fire wasn't just warmth, it was identity. How you built your hearth, what you burned, how you kept it alive through the long, mind-numbing hours of night. That was your signature. It defined whether your shelter was a place to live or a place to die more slowly. The most basic form of heat came from the open fireplace. Just a pile of stones, really, arranged into a rough half-moon shape, maybe with a hole in the roof or wall to let smoke out, if you were lucky. Early settlers often used what's called a stick-and-mud chimney, a woven lattice of sticks slathered in thick mud, stacked vertically to create a vent. The result was a chimney that worked great, until it dried out too much and caught fire, which it often did. Surprise! You've just finished building your own. You stack river rocks into a tidy base, then lay mud and scrap timber into something resembling a chimney. The smoke escapes. Kind of. And when you light the fire, it draws upward. Mostly. Every once in a while, a rogue plume curls back inside and smacks you in the face like a hot ghost. Still, the cabin gets warmer. Your fingertips tingle. You sit close enough to singe your boots, but not so close you go up with them. Balance. But fireplaces were horribly inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up and out through the chimney, and to keep things toasty, you had to keep feeding the beast. Hour after hour, firewood became currency. Families would spend entire days chopping, splitting, and stacking logs, piling them high against the outside wall, under tarps or bits of old canvas to keep them dry. A well-stocked woodpile wasn't just convenience, it was insurance. You didn't brag about your wealth out here, you bragged about your cords of seasoned oak. That brings us to the next evolutionary leap in frontier heating, the cast iron stove. If your neighbours had one, you hated them a little. These beauties were heavy, efficient, and about as comforting as a big metal hug. They radiated heat evenly, and used less wood than an open fireplace. Some models even had a cooking surface or oven built in. Of course, getting one wasn't easy. You either dragged it hundreds of miles by oxen, paid a king's ransom to a passing trader, or inherited it from someone less fortunate, i.e. someone who froze to death last winter. But when it worked, it was glorious. Imagine stoking the fire once and staying warm for hours, cooking stew while drying wet socks on the side, sitting near the glowing belly of that stove with your family, telling stories, or, more likely, just existing in tired silence. Some settlers named their stoves, some wrote songs about them. One legendary tale tells of a man who left his stove behind while fleeing a blizzard, only to return 3 days later, weeping to dig it out like a long-lost lover. Then there were the improvised solutions, the frontier equivalent of space heaters built from junk and luck. Clay ovens, charcoal braziers, even inverted metal buckets filled with coals. Some folks ran hot stones from the fire into their bedding, hoping to capture just a few hours of warmth before it all went cold again. Others slept with heated bricks at their feet, or tucked in next to the stove like dogs. Actual dogs, by the way, were highly prized heating companions. Loyal, furry, non-judgmental. Of course, the battle for warmth wasn't just about generating heat. It was about keeping it in, which meant insulation. And back then, insulation was, well, whatever you had lying around. Mud was standard. So were buffalo robes, thick quilts, and crumpled newspapers stuffed between wall gaps. Animal hides were nailed over windows if you had any. Even snow itself became insulation. Believe it or not, it works. Once it piles up around your home, it traps heat inside like a natural igloo effect. But heat was always temporary, always fragile. You'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel the chill creeping back in, inching up from the floor, down from the ceiling. Your fire had died. Your breath fogged the air. So you drag yourself from under the covers, fingers stiff, knees aching, and coax the embers back to life. Maybe blow gently, maybe curse, probably both. Quirky fact of the night. Some people slept with hot potatoes in their pockets or tucked into bed, not as food, as heaters. Bake a potato in the stove, wrap it in cloth, and you've got a makeshift hot water bottle that doubles as breakfast. That's what we call frontier multitasking. But this raises a big question historians still chew on today. How many people actually managed to stay warm during the worst winters? Some records claim families slept in comfort, while others describe frost forming on the inside of walls, frozen wash basins, and livestock wandering into the house for warmth. The truth likely shifts depending on class, resources, and sheer dumb luck. You're somewhere in the middle. Your fire is burning again. The cabin is smoky, but warmer than the world outside. You sit with your back to the stone hearth, legs stretched out, steam rising from your wet socks. Outside, the wind gusts flinging snow like knives across the plain. But inside, in your tiny slice of carved-out wilderness, it's not so bad. Eventually you lie down, rolling close to the wall where the heat lingers longest. You listen to the logs popping, to the wind's sighs and moans. There's no hum of electricity, no creak of radiators, no digital thermostat. Just you, your fire, and the hope it holds out till dawn. This is winter in the West, not just endured, but challenged, defied, and heated one flickering flame at a time. Morning creaks in slow and heavy, the sun a pale disk trying to shine through a curtain of frost. Your eyelids stick for a second before they blink open, and your breath makes a little puff cloud that floats briefly, then fades into the cold. The fire's down to smouldering coals, and your fingers feel like stiff twigs. You roll over under the scratchy quilt, not ready to brave the air just yet. But survival doesn't really come with a snooze button out here. You throw on your boots, still damp, and shuffle over to restart the fire. A few breaths, a few hopeful pokes with a half-burned stick, and the embers catch. Flame flares back up, and warmth creeps its way through the small shelter like an apology. You sit back with a grunt. You've got shelter. You've got fire. But that's not all that kept people alive through Wild West winters. There's something else, something not made of wood or earth or stone. It's survival passed hand to hand, whispered from generation to generation, shaped by people who lived here long before you. It's knowledge, specifically native knowledge. Long before settlers ever arrived with their wagons full of mistakes, indigenous peoples had been thriving in these same unforgiving winters. Lakota, Cheyenne, Ute, Shoshone, and dozens more knew how to read the land like a book and adjust their shelters to what it was telling them. And when newcomers stumbled onto the frontier and realized they were wildly unprepared for how fast their eyelashes could freeze together, many had no choice but to learn from those who actually knew what they were doing. One of the most brilliant shelter designs you'll come across, the Earth Lodge. Built by tribes like the Mandan and Hidatsa, these were massive dome-shaped structures made from a timber frame covered with layers of brush, grass and earth. They could be 30 feet across, house entire extended families, and stay warm even in the teeth of a Great Plains blizzard. The rounded shape helped prevent snow build-up and cut down on wind resistance. Inside, a central fire pit heated the space evenly, and smoke escaped through a clever hole in the roof that doubled as a skylight. Functional and atmospheric. The insulation? Incredible! Packed dirt walls meant stable temperatures and real warmth, not the kind that vanishes when you shift your blanket wrong. It was the original open concept living with geothermal perks. Now contrast that with the average settler, who showed up with dreams and maybe half a blueprint from a book they once read. When winter hit, many of them copied indigenous techniques without fully understanding the principles behind them. They'd imitate a lodge's shape or try to replicate a teepee without realizing that materials and placement mattered just as much as form. Speaking of teepees, don't let the conical shape fool you. These were mobile engineering marvels. The Plains tribes, particularly the Lakota and Blackfoot, used teepees year-round, including in winter, with surprising effectiveness. Covered in buffalo hides, supported by a dozen or more long poles, the design could resist high winds, shed snow, and stay warm inside with a central fire. The hide flap near the top, adjustable. That's right, early HVAC. The inside of a winter teepee was often lined with extra furs and hides. Families slept close together for warmth. Fire was contained in the centre, with stones placed around it to absorb heat and radiate it long after the flames died. Some people even dug a shallow trench around the fire to help with air circulation. This wasn't just camping. This was science, culture, and survival, wrapped in buffalo and intelligence. You crouch by your fire and think about how much of what kept people alive wasn't invention. It was adaptation. The settlers who survived longest were the ones who listened, traded, observed. They learned how to choose better shelter locations by watching where native communities built theirs, often near tree-covered ridges that blocked wind, or close to water sources that didn't freeze completely in winter. Quirky fact. Some settlers were so impressed by native survival skills that they abandoned their own structures altogether. There are accounts of traders and trappers ditching cabins to live in teepees for the winter because they were warmer. There's one tale of a French trapper in Wyoming who refused to sleep in his own cabin after spending a winter in a Lakota camp, called the teepee the only warm thing in this cold land. But as always, there's tension in the narrative. Modern scholars debate how much of this knowledge was respectfully exchanged versus stolen or misused. Some indigenous communities welcomed settlers at first, shared techniques, helped them through early winters. Others were wary, and rightfully so. Because as more settlers came, those same shelters and lands were taken. The knowledge remained, but the balance didn't. You toss another log on the fire, listening to it catch with a low whoosh. Outside, the wind is picking up again, and snow starts to swirl against the window, if you can call your waxed paper square a window. You think about how your little shelter might have fared without the tricks you borrowed, from that dugout idea to the way you packed earth into the cracks. Even the way you built your fire pit is more indigenous science than settler guesswork. The truth is, survival in the Wild West wasn't about rugged individualism. Not really. It was about community, sometimes forced, sometimes chosen. It was about watching someone who knew better and saying, "Teach me." It was about knowing when to be stubborn and when to sit down and listen. So as another winter day begins, you've got a bit more confidence, not just in your walls or your fire, but in the knowledge you've picked up along the way, from the ground, from the wind, and from the people who've known this land far longer than you have. You reach for your tin mug and take a sip of something hot. Weak coffee, maybe, or strong tea made from pine needles because that's what's available. It's not fancy, but it's warm, and right now, that's more than enough. By now you've figured out the rules of the game. Don't fight the cold, outsmart it. Which is all well and good, but outsmarting something that creeps under your door, seeps through your socks and settles in your bones like regret. That takes creativity, and that's where we get to the next unsung frontier skill, insulation. Not the pink fluffy stuff you see in modern attics, no. This was whatever you can get your freezing hands on, insulation. And trust me, people got creative. You wake up this morning with a familiar problem. It's warmer near the fire, but the corners of your shelter, still icebox cold. Your breath hangs like little ghosts over your bedroll, and even the blanket's stiff from last night's damp. So, while you wait for your morning tea water to thaw from its solid block state, you start thinking, how can you seal this place tighter? First, you tackle the obvious gaps, between logs, around the door, near the roofline, any place where wind whistles through like it's got concert tickets. You shove in more mud and dried grass, the classic chinking mix. It's messy, crumbles easily and gets under your fingernails, but it helps. Still, it's not enough. So you look around for something else, something you've seen other settlers use, often with a sort of desperate flair. You start tearing up old newspaper, not to read, mind you, that ship sailed weeks ago, but to stuff. Stuff into cracks, line the walls, layer under bedding. Newsprint, in the absence of modern materials, becomes insulation gold. You press it tight along the inside of your walls, layering pages until it starts to feel just slightly less like you're living inside a freezer with a fireplace. Bonus, you get to read half a 10-year-old editorial about wheat prices while trying not to freeze to death. Educational and insulating. Settlers weren't picky. If it blocked wind, it got nailed to the wall. Rags, flour sacks, canvas, old curtains, even animal hides, especially buffalo or deer, were all fair game. Some cabins were lined with fur on the inside like a reverse animal, warm and dark and faintly gamey smelling. Others used what they called rag carpet, basically old clothes woven together and tacked to walls or floors. Not cute, but definitely warmer. Quirky insulation hack of the night? Some folks used dried cow manure. You heard me. Not as padding, but as wall covering. Dried compacted patties of dung were stuck between boards or pressed into cracks, acting as both insulator and, well, a firm lesson in humility. Don't worry, the smell mostly fades after a few days. Maybe. Windows, of course, were a luxury most couldn't afford. Glass was expensive and brittle, and dragging it across mountains and rivers in a wagon was a guaranteed way to turn it into 1,000 shiny regrets. So instead, people used alternatives. Oiled paper was the go-to, sheets of thin paper soaked in animal fat or linseed oil until translucent. You tack them up, and voila, light gets in, but not the wind. Mostly, if you layer it, and pray. Some settlers added wooden shutters over these makeshift windows to keep the worst of the wind and snow at bay. During the day, you might open them just a crack for light. At night, you slammed them shut and hoped they didn't blow open at 3 a.m. like some dramatic ghost entering stage left. You step back now and take stock of your latest upgrades. Your cabin, once just a skeleton of logs and smoke, is starting to feel more like a nest. The walls are thicker, the air less brittle. When you sit near the fire, you can almost pretend it's warm enough to take your coat off. Almost. But insulation wasn't just about walls and windows. It extended to clothing, bedding, even the ground. People slept on straw mattresses stuffed with hay, or piles of evergreen branches layered with cloth. The goal? Elevate your body off the frozen earth just enough to avoid becoming a human icicle. And clothing. Oh boy. Layers upon layers. Long underwear, wool shirts, vests, heavy coats, scarves, mittens and socks inside more socks. If you were lucky, you had access to wool. If you were rich, buffalo robes. And if you were practical, you patched everything into oblivion. There's a kind of frontier fashion chic that just says, yes, this used to be a flour sack. It's a mitten now, don't judge me. Still, warmth was often a game of inches. You might go to sleep reasonably comfortable, only to wake up with frost on your eyelashes and the edge of your blanket frozen to the wall. One settler wrote about waking up to find their coffee had frozen solid, inside the house next to the fire. Another recalled that their mother used to heat bricks in the stove and wrap them in towels to sleep with. Those bricks were still icy by morning, but slightly less icy than everything else. And here's the debate. How effective was any of this? Did newspapers and mud and buffalo hides really work, or is this just frontier myth-making at its finest? Historians argue both sides. Some say settlers exaggerated their hardship for dramatic effect in letters and diaries. Others claim the stories were toned down out of embarrassment. The truth? Likely somewhere in between. Some shelters were cleverly insulated and surprisingly warm. Others were tragic examples of wishful thinking and frozen boots. You lean back in your chair, or more realistically your upside-down crate, and stretch out your legs. The fire crackles. The wind claws at the walls, but you've muffled its bite. Not completely, but enough. Enough to sit still without shivering. Enough to boil tea water without ice forming on the surface. Enough to survive the night. You look around at the patchwork of materials holding this place together. Dirt and wood, newspaper and cowhide, smoke and stubbornness. It's not much, but it's yours. And more importantly, it's working. Because out here in the Wild West, winter wasn't something you beat. It wasn't something you conquered. It was something you outlasted. One page of newspaper, one ragged quilt, one smoky breath at a time. By mid-afternoon, the wind picks up like it's trying to tear the skin off the world. Your cabin groans. The door creaks in its frame. Outside, the landscape disappears behind a curtain of horizontal snow. And inside, well, you're sitting cross-legged by the fire, draped in 2 coats, 3 blankets, and a slowly unravelling sense of optimism. It's winter in the West, and you're about to learn what it means to ride out a storm in the flimsiest of all possible shelters, the canvas tent. Let's say you're not a settler with land or a proper cabin. Maybe you're a miner, a railroad worker, or a seasonal cowboy drifting between jobs. You travel light, you sleep where you can, and when winter hits, you hunker down in a tent that was clearly designed by someone who never met wind. It's thin, it leaks, it flaps like a terrified bird, and if you don't set it up right, or weigh it down properly, you'll wake up face to face with the stars and snow, because your tent decided to relocate itself during the night. But here's the thing. Despite being so fragile, tent cities were everywhere, mining towns especially. During the rushes in California, Colorado, and later Montana and the Yukon, people flooded into the mountains faster than cabins could be built, so they pitched canvas shelters wherever there was flat ground. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, in neat rows like a pioneer pop-up nightmare. White flaps rippling in the cold, little fires going in front of everyone. And inside, chaos, mud, smoke, booze, and hope, all jammed into the same 20 square feet. You've decided to visit one of these camps, hypothetically of course. Maybe it's in Deadwood or Bannock, or some half-forgotten hole in the Rockies, with more gold dust than common sense. You duck into a tent, shaking the snow off your shoulders, and you're immediately hit with a cocktail of smells. Wet wool, tobacco, old stew, and something that might have once been whiskey or foot rot. Hard to say. There are 4 men squeezed inside, each huddled under blankets, boots off, socks steaming near the stove in the middle. Yes, that's right. Some tents had stoves. Not full iron monsters like in cabins, but tiny sheet metal stoves designed to heat just enough space to keep toes attached. Smoke escaped through a stovepipe poked through a canvas flap or rigged with rocks to stop it from collapsing inward. It was like heating a tissue box with a candle, but hey, heat is heat. The floor? Either packed earth or hastily laid wooden planks if you were lucky. More often, it was mud. Mud that froze at night and melted during the day. People tried throwing down hay or straw, but it got wet fast. One old-timer described sleeping on a floor so cold his breath froze the inside of his bedroll. Another said he woke up with his moustache stuck to the tent wall. Hair apparently makes a decent adhesive when combined with condensation and regret. These tent cities weren't just makeshift homes, they were entire micro-civilizations. Saloons operated out of large canvas setups, complete with bars and card tables. General stores sold supplies out of tents with flapping walls and no locks. Some even had churches, with sermons delivered under canvas and the congregation huddled together for warmth and forgiveness. It was all very godly, if you ignored the swearing and whiskey breath. Quirky detail time. Some frontier entrepreneurs actually designed double-layered tents for extreme cold. Canvas on the outside, wool or felt linings inside, with extra flaps to button up in storms. One company called them Arctic wool tents, and they were advertised as the solution to every miner's frostbitten nightmare. Did they work? Somewhat. They were warmer, but also heavier, pricier, and harder to set up than a regular tent. Most folks went with the standard model and just layered themselves like human onions. Now, here's where it gets dicey. Tents, for all their flexibility, were incredibly vulnerable in a true storm. High winds could tear stakes out of the ground, heavy snow collapsed roofs, and fire. Oh, fire was a constant flirtation with disaster. One wrong move, and your entire home could go up in flames faster than you could shout, "Was that my only blanket?" Some camps burned down entirely because someone knocked over a lantern while trying to swat a mosquito in January. Tragic, but also impressive. And yet people lived this way for entire seasons. Some even preferred it. Think about it. You could pack up and move the whole thing. If work dried up or a new strike was found across the ridge, you didn't leave a house behind. You rolled up your tent and followed the promise. It was a rootless life, but for many that was the point. Still, historians debate the wisdom of tent cities in winter. Some call them disaster shelters with PR, pointing out the countless cases of hypothermia, illness, and death. Others argue that for mobile workers they were a brilliant short-term solution, quick to build, easy to dismantle, and capable of housing hundreds in a matter of days. Like everything in the Wild West, context mattered. If you had no other option, canvas was better than sky. You think about that now, tucked safely in your cabin, with your chinked walls and fire pit and buffalo robe patch door. It's not glamorous, but it's solid. Outside, the wind is screaming, really going for it, and you can almost imagine those canvas tents flapping wildly, anchors straining, ropes groaning. Somewhere out there, someone is cursing at their stove, trying to keep it lit as smoke pours back inside. Someone else is burrowing deeper into a pile of blankets, willing themselves to morning. And you? You're grateful. Grateful for logs, for dirt, for every miserable hour you spent digging and stacking and packing. Because now, in the thick of the storm, you're not lying under canvas, praying the wind doesn't carry your entire life into the nearest ravine. You poke the fire, sip your tea, and pull the blanket tighter. Outside, the storm rages. Inside, you've got space to stretch your legs, a roof that doesn't sag, and walls that don't breathe with every gust. Not bad for a pile of mud and timber in the middle of nowhere. The storm hangs around like an unwanted guest, spitting snow sideways and moaning across the plains, in a tone that suggests it's offended by your very existence. You've barely slept. The wind battered the cabin all night, rattling the walls, slipping through any crack it could find like a nosy neighbour with cold fingers. But you stayed dry, you stayed warm, mostly, and your roof, miraculously, didn't cave in. You're starting to understand why old frontier sayings sound so dramatic. Out here, the roof held isn't just good news, it's practically a love letter to physics. This morning you wake up to a peculiar sound, not the usual creak of timbers or the popping fire. No, this is a slow, steady drip. You sit up, drip, again. You look toward the corner of the room. There it is, melting snow from your mostly waterproof roof, weeping down onto your bedding like a gentle reminder that nothing is ever truly finished. Welcome to frontier roofing. It's easy to underestimate how important a roof is until your hair is damp and your socks squish. In theory, a roof is just a hat for your house. In practice, it's the line between sleeping peacefully and waking up in a puddle of your own bad choices. The earlier settlers tried whatever they could. Shingles were ideal, but that meant you had to split them yourself, often by hand, using a froe and a mallet. A froe, by the way, is basically a glorified wedge, and using one in winter is a test of patience. shoulder strength, and how many curse words you know. You take logs, split them into thin wedges, then overlap them carefully on your roof like wooden fish scales. If you were lucky, you had cedar or redwood, which resisted rot. If not, you used whatever was nearby and hoped the snow didn't find a way in. Spoiler alert, it always found a way in. Many people didn't have the time or energy to fuss with shingles, so they went the sod route again, stacking thick layers of dirt and grass over a timber frame, then patting it down like frosting a very sad, muddy cake. Sod roofs were heavy, like might crush your house if you get a snowstorm on top of it heavy. But they were also insulating, cheap and easy to patch. Just throw more mud on the leak and pretend it isn't dripping on your face. Of course, the problem with sod was erosion. Rain and melting snow would slowly eat away at it, turning your roof into a biology experiment. One quirky fact from the frontier journals: some folks actually had a grass growing inside their homes. Roots would dangle through cracks in the ceiling, and in springtime little blades of green would sprout overhead. One settler joked that he woke up with a full lawn above his bed, and briefly thought he'd been buried alive. Some pioneers went for bark roofing, overlapping pieces of tree bark nailed to rafters. It worked decently well in dry climates, but warped like a potato chip in wet ones. Others used tar paper, if they could get their hands on it. Basically, heavy-duty felt soaked in tar to make it waterproof. But it tore easily, and had a tendency to flap and peel in high winds, sounding like a bear trying to break in. Then there were the truly desperate solutions: oilcloth, canvas, stretched animal hides. One man reportedly used flattened tin can lids, hammered together like armour. It sort of worked. Also looked like a house wearing chainmail. Points for creativity, if not style. And if you're thinking this all sounds like a miserable battle against the elements, congratulations, you're correct. Settlers spent an absurd amount of time climbing onto their roofs in the dead of winter, patching holes while snow blew sideways into their faces. No ladder? No problem. Stack some barrels. Hope you don't fall. One diary entry describes a man fixing his roof during a sleet storm, holding the tarp down with one hand and nailing with the other, yelling the whole time that he was going to burn the whole place down and move back east. He didn't. No one ever did. Debates among scholars persist. Were these roofing methods effective, or just barely better than nothing? Some argue that with the right pitch and materials, even a basic sod roof could last a decade. Others suggest that constant maintenance was inevitable, and you just learned to live with a little indoor precipitation. You decide to tackle your own leak with the tools at hand. You grab a chunk of frozen mud and some old rags, then climb up into the rafters. Your hands go numb immediately, and for a brief moment, you understand every curse word your ancestors ever uttered. But you find the gap, pack it tight, and climb back down. Will it hold? Maybe. Will it collapse dramatically in the middle of the night, soaking your bedding and dignity? Also maybe. Still, something about this whole process is oddly satisfying. You patch your roof, stoke your fire, and dry your socks by the hearth. You listen to the snow thudding against the roof, and marvel that it's not coming in. You've turned a pile of logs and dirt into something that holds fast against the wind and wet. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but solidly. That's the Wild West approach to shelter in a nutshell. It wasn't about perfection. It was about enough. Enough roof to keep you dry, enough heat to keep you alive, enough pride to say, I built this, even if it leaks a little. By nightfall, your cabin smells like wood smoke, damp wool, and a faint hint of wet soil from your improvised roof patch. You tuck into your blankets, listening for drips. Nothing yet. A good sign. The wind sighs overhead and the roof creaks but holds. You close your eyes, fingers warm around a cup of tea, and drift off under a ceiling that might not be perfect. But tonight, it's enough. You wake up to the unmistakable sound of something very large and very cold sliding off your roof. It hits the ground with a thud heavy enough to rattle your coffee tin off the shelf. You sit up fast, heart pounding, until you realise it's just a blanket of snow letting go after the sun finally convinced it to move. Still, it's a reminder. Winter's not done with you. It's never really done. It just shifts its weight and waits for the next weak spot in your plan. You step outside, blinking into the crisp daylight, and your boots crunch through a crust of ice. The storm's past. The sky's that weirdly intense shade of blue it only gets after a blizzard. The kind of blue that makes your nose run before you even feel cold. You walk the perimeter of your cabin, inspecting the roof, the corners, the firewood stack, which is half buried again, because naturally. And that's when you think of them. The people who don't have cabins, the ones out on the trails pushing cattle across the frozen plains, sleeping under the stars with a saddle for a pillow. It's time to talk about cowboys, and the bunkhouses, tents and makeshift shelters they built while herding cattle, through weather that respected no one. Now Hollywood has done a bang-up job of convincing people that cowboys rode in endless sun, boots gleaming, hats tilted just so. In reality, they rode through sleet, mud and snow thick enough to swallow a horse whole. And when winter hit hard during a drive, they didn't have the luxury of a cabin or even a half-decent tarp. Their shelter had to be fast, portable and tough enough to survive the wind, rain and long, boring nights in the middle of nowhere. That's where bunkhouses came in. Back at ranch headquarters, often hundreds of miles from the cattle drive routes, these were the winter homes of cowhands lucky enough to stay put. Picture a long, low building, usually made of logs or rough lumber, with a single stove in the centre and rows of cots along the walls. There was no privacy, no room for nonsense, just heat, sleep, and snoring. You open the door to a bunkhouse and get hit with a smell cocktail. Old leather, unwashed socks, wood smoke, and 10 different brands of stubborn. The place is dim, loud, and alive. Cowboys in heavy coats dry their boots by the stove. Someone stirs a pot of coffee that's probably been simmering for days. A deck of cards slaps down on a crate turntable. It's not cosy, exactly, but there's warmth in the walls and in the rhythm of shared survival. Bunkhouses were simple but functional. Slanted roofs to shed snow, boarded windows, thick doors with iron latches. Walls often lined with extra blankets or old feed sacks nailed up for insulation. It wasn't uncommon to see a dog or two curled up near the stove, unofficial members of the crew earning their spot with loyalty and body heat. Now, if you weren't lucky enough to be at the ranch during a freeze, you made do on the trail. Cowboys on cattle drives slept in bedrolls, also known as cowboy burritos. These were basically canvas sheets wrapped around layers of wool blankets, designed to keep you dry and warmish when laid directly on frozen ground. If it rained or snowed, you threw a slicker over yourself and prayed the cattle didn't stampede. No tents, no roofs, just stars and frost. Some trail bosses brought along chuck wagons, rolling kitchens packed with supplies, pots, coffee, and a grizzled cook named something like Cookie, who didn't tolerate whining. These wagons had canvas flaps that could be rigged into lean-tos or windbreaks, and they sometimes became shelters themselves during sudden storms. Everyone crowded in, boots to faces, trying to avoid getting stepped on or dripped on. Quirky fact here. Some cowboys used to sleep with their boots on, literally under their bedrolls, to keep them from freezing solid overnight. Others stuffed them with hot rocks or coals wrapped in cloth. It worked, but not always. One story tells of a cowboy who had to thaw his boots over the fire in the morning and accidentally caught them on fire. He spent the rest of the drive in moccasins made from a butchered saddlebag. Wind was the cowboy's worst enemy. It could drop the temperature 20 degrees in minutes, and a poorly placed camp meant a night of shivering and muttered curses. Cowboys learned to look for natural windbreaks, hills, tree lines, rock formations, and always set their fires with care. Flames weren't just for heat. They were protection, light, comfort. Sometimes the only thing standing between a long night and a longer story. Scholars debate just how rough cowboy life really was in winter. Some romanticize it. The grit, the freedom, the long rides across snow-dusted plains. Others argue it was miserable, thankless, and so physically demanding it aged young men before their time. There's truth in both. The cowboy lifestyle demanded toughness, but it also bred camaraderie. Bunkhouses were loud, crowded, and often filthy, but they were also warm, shared, alive. You walk back into your own shelter now, dragging some firewood behind you. It's quieter here, smaller, but compared to a trail camp or a leaking tent, it feels like a palace. The fire sputters as you feed it, and the warmth begins to return to your fingertips. Somewhere out there, in the middle of a snow-covered plain, a few cowboys are still out riding, still trying to push a half-frozen herd through drifts as high as their saddles. When they finally stop for the night, they'll wrap up in those bedrolls, stretch out near a fire, and fall asleep to the sound of wind and cattle lowing in the dark. And you? You'll sleep on a dry floor tonight, under a roof that held, walls that don't flap, and a fire that doesn't blow out every 15 minutes. You settle in, the wind rattling less now, You pull your blanket up, shift a little closer to the stove, and think, if cowboys could sleep under the stars and still wake up grinning, you can definitely make it through another night in your four walls and borrowed tricks. You wake up with the distinct feeling that the cabin is smaller than it was yesterday. It's not. Of course it's not. But the walls feel closer, the air heavier, and there's a soft, muffled quality to the world outside that says snow has piled up in places it absolutely shouldn't. You shove aside your blanket, sit up stiffly, and reach for your boots. They're cold. Not frozen this time. Small victories, but still stiff enough to make you wince as you slide your feet in. Today you're going prospecting. Not for gold, at least not real gold. You're chasing the story of those who did. The people who, for some unfathomable reason, thought it was a great idea to chase gold into the dead of winter and live in cabins the size of closets, while entire mountains tried to bury them alive. You step outside and feel it immediately. Stillness. The kind that settles in thick after a heavy snow. The world is quiet, blanketed, frozen at the seams. The cold snaps at your face as you start walking, but it's nothing compared to what those gold rush prospectors faced up in the Sierras or the Rockies, or if they were feeling especially reckless, Alaska. Let's say you're in the late 1840s, just after the California gold rush kicks off. Thousands of men, sometimes whole families, head west with stars in their eyes and no clear plan beyond dig until rich. Problem is, gold doesn't care about the seasons. It's buried in hills and creeks and veins of quartz regardless of whether there's 3 feet of snow on top of it. And that means people dug in, literally and figuratively, for the winter. Your shelter, a prospector's cabin. The term is generous. These were often tiny, hastily built wooden structures, barely more than boxes, with low ceilings, thin walls and doors that creaked like they were protesting your life choices. Sometimes they were built into hillsides for insulation, like an upgraded dugout. More often, they were standalone structures surrounded by snowdrifts tall enough to swallow a mule. Inside, the decor was sparse, a cot or straw mattress, a tiny stove or fire pit, maybe a shelf with canned goods and tools. Sometimes 2 or 3 men crammed into a space barely large enough for one. They shared everything: heat, food, lice. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a joke. But when the wind started howling and the snow pressed up against the windows, they were just glad to have 4 walls and a roof. These cabins weren't just shelters, they were pressure cookers for isolation. Many miners stayed put during the worst months, snowed in completely. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to. Trails vanished, supplies ran out. They passed time playing cards, carving wooden trinkets, or staring at the walls until they blurred. Journals from the era are full of entries like, "Snowed in again," "Haven't seen sun in 12 days," "Jenkins snores like a dying moose." Some built rock and wood hybrids using whatever they could find. A stone base for insulation, timber for the upper structure, sod or bark on the roof. Not pretty but sturdy. A few even dug their shelters into abandoned mine shafts. Convenient if you ignored the possibility of cave-ins and ghosts. One quirky, lesser-known shelter style, the tent cabin. Prospectors would stretch canvas or hide over a wooden frame, sometimes using sticks or salvaged mine supports, and insulate it with moss or blankets. It was the frontier equivalent of a studio apartment with a shower curtain door. But hey, it beat sleeping under the stars in sub-zero temperatures with a pickaxe as a pillow. Now let's talk about fire. Out here, in these tiny snow-smothered boxes, fire wasn't just warmth, it was life support. A single mistake, knocking over a lantern, placing a log wrong, building too hot a fire in a weak stove, and your entire shelter could go up like kindling. And when it didn't, the smoke filled the room anyway, because ventilation was, let's call it, experimental. Most prospectors lived in a haze of wood smoke and coughing for months. Food was another adventure. Some men had canned goods, beans, salted pork, condensed milk. Others subsisted on hardtack, coffee and melted snow. Fresh meat was rare unless you were near game, which, in winter, not so much. One particularly grim account describes a group eating boiled leather from their saddles. Another refers to mystery stew, which we're not going to ask follow-up questions about. And yet, somehow, these cabins became sanctuaries. With the storm howling outside and the stove glowing red, there was a kind of peace in them. A rhythm. Wake, eat, tend the fire, dig a bit, sleep, repeat. Days blurred, weeks slipped past. and when spring came, those who'd lasted through the cold stepped outside like moles blinking in the light, a little thinner, a little smellier, but alive. Of course, not everyone made it. Many died of exposure, hunger, or accidents. Some simply disappeared, their cabins found months later, collapsed and empty, wind drifting snow through the broken door. Others gave up and headed back east, bitter and frostbitten, their dreams of gold replaced with dreams of blankets and hot baths. Historians still argue whether most prospectors were brave or foolish for staying through winter. Some see them as reckless optimists, unprepared for the brutality of mountain life. Others see grit, grimy, exhausted grit, in men who faced the worst nature had to offer and didn't blink, or at least didn't blink fast enough to give up. You reach what would have been a mining cabin site now, just a low ridge where logs once stood, half swallowed by snow and time. You imagine it, a flickering fire inside, boots thawing by the wall, someone snoring in the corner while another pokes at the stove like it personally insulted them. It's gone now, reclaimed by the land, but for a few long winters it held fast. You head back to your own cabin, the cold sinking into your coat again. Your walls are better built, your food's less mysterious, but the same sense of survival pulses in you, the same determination that drove men to dig into frozen hillsides and call it home. You open your door, stomp the snow from your boots and step into warmth. Your fire greets you with a hiss and pop, and your cabin, cramped and smoky though it may be, feels like a fortress. You made it through another day, just like they did. Snow's coming again. You can feel it in your joints before it even starts to fall. A dull ache in your knees, a certain heaviness in the air. You've started to develop the sixth sense all winter survivors get, the ability to tell what's coming just by the way the wind sounds, or how the sky leans a little greyer than usual. That's what happens after weeks on the edge, with nothing but fire and grit keeping you out of a shallow grave. Today's job is simple in theory, irritating in practice. Gather building material, wood, rocks, mud, anything you might need to reinforce your little cabin. Because the truth is, not every part of the West came with the same menu of resources. Some settlers had trees, some had hills, and some had rocks. That's it. Just rocks, wind, and the deeply humbling realization that a pile of boulders might be your best shot at not freezing to death. So let's head to the timberline, that invisible altitude where trees just stop growing and life becomes a cruel scavenger hunt. Imagine you've made the questionable decision to settle high in the mountains. Maybe you're trapping, maybe you're mining, maybe you're just running from something and the cold feels like justice. Either way, congratulations. You've now discovered what it means to build shelter in a place where the trees gave up long before you arrived. No wood, no problem, just get creative, and very, very tired. You start by scouting for stone, flat ones, big ones, small ones to wedge between gaps. You haul them back to your site one at a time, each trip an exhausting lesson in gravity. Then comes the mud, frozen, stubborn, and only barely willing to cooperate. You scrape it together, thaw it near your fire, and mix it with straw or moss if you've got any. This becomes your mortar, or your glue, or just something to smear between the rocks and pretend it's helping. This is the stone cabin, also called a rock house or miner's hut. The walls are thick, heavy, and deceptively solid. When the wind howls, they don't creak like logs. They stand. They're less insulated, sure, but with the right design, low roof, small interior, and a roaring fire, you can survive. Maybe even be warm. On one side, you build a small fire pit with a chimney, probably made of the same rock. If you're lucky, you've scavenged an old stovepipe or rigged something from metal scraps. If not, the smoke just finds its way out through a hole in the roof, or the gap above the door. You'll cough a lot. Get used to it. These shelters weren't glamorous, but they worked. Prospectors in Colorado and Utah, trappers in the high Rockies, and outlaws hiding in remote canyons all built stone huts to ride out the winter. Some were just one room with a dirt floor and a thatched roof. Others were partially dug into hillsides, combining stone walls with earth insulation. The common theme, desperation meets ingenuity. One fringe example of this style comes from the sheepherder's cave. Not a metaphor, just a literal cave. When winter hit and there were no trees, some herders and loners took to carving into cliffs, natural rock formations or riverbanks. They'd dig just deep enough to get out of the wind, maybe add a rock wall across the front, build a fire pit and settle in. One such cave in Idaho still shows scorch marks on the ceiling and crude bed frames carved into the walls. It's barely taller than a man and just wide enough to lie down. Not a home, more like a hiding place with amenities. Of course, the lack of timber wasn't just a construction problem, it was a heating one. No trees meant no firewood, and if you think building a cabin out of rocks is hard, try heating one with them. People burned anything that would catch. Dried sagebrush, roots, manure, or even chunks of dried moss peeled from boulders. Some ingenious souls figured out how to trap heat using stones themselves, placing them in the fire until they were red hot, then tucking them in metal boxes or wrapping them in cloth to use like primitive space heaters. One quirky trick from trappers: heat up a large flat stone in the fire, wrap it in a coat, and slide it under your bedroll. You'd fall asleep with it warming your back and wake up to frost on your moustache, but still it helped. Other folks lined their beds with hot sand or filled canvas bags with embers, hoping the heat would last until dawn. Spoiler, it didn't. But a few hours was better than none. There's still debate today among historians about just how widespread these stone shelters really were. Some argue they were common in high-altitude settlements and remote outposts, especially where wood was truly scarce. Others think they were rare, a fringe solution for the most desperate or isolated. Archaeological remains suggest both. For every well-preserved stone hut, there are dozens lost to time, crumbled and forgotten on mountain slopes too cold for memory. You sit now inside your own cobbled-together hybrid shelter. Part log, part stone, part whatever you dragged back yesterday. The walls are uneven. The roof dips slightly. But when you light your fire and the warmth bounces off the rocks, there's a surprising sense of comfort. Solidness. Like this place won't fall apart the moment the wind screams, and scream it does. The storm begins again outside, wind carving patterns into the snowdrifts, the sky darkening like it's offended by your existence. But your walls don't flinch. They don't groan or sway. They just stand there, heavy and quiet. You ladle out some thin stew, beans and salt pork again, and eat slowly, watching the firelight dance on stone. You think of the people who built these kinds of shelters in worse places, with less to work with, and still made it to spring. You're not so different. Just another stubborn soul with cold fingers and an unreasonable amount of hope. When you finally crawl into your bedroll, it's with a heated stone tucked beneath your knees, a wool blanket over your face, and a mental note to haul more rocks tomorrow. Because winter doesn't stop, but neither do you. You wake up in the middle of the night to a sharp crack. Not the kind that signals doom. No, this one's deeper, duller, like the land itself shifting under its frozen skin. You lie still for a moment, listening. Another crack echoes in the distance, then silence. Just the slow hiss of the fire, and your own breath curling into the air. Welcome to the West's winter chorus, nature making casual threats in the dark. When morning comes, it's cold enough to hurt. Not just grab an extra blanket cold, but your coffee froze solid before you could drink it, cold. You shuffle over to the hearth, prod the coals, and blow them back to life with a few huffs that leave your lips numb. Once the flame takes, you stretch your hands over the heat and brace yourself for the day's task, dealing with winter food storage. See, surviving the cold wasn't just about warmth, it was about not starving, which sounds obvious, until you realise how difficult it was to keep food from either freezing into a brick or being eaten by something with more fur and sharper teeth. And out here, there were no grocery stores, no corner markets, just root cellars, ice houses, and a very delicate dance between preserving and perishing. You start by checking your own little storage system. Behind the cabin, tucked into the frozen ground, is a narrow pit covered with old boards and snow. You brush it clear, lift the creaky lid, and peer down into your personal treasure trove. Potatoes, dried apples, salt pork wrapped in waxed cloth, and, bless it all, a jar of pickled eggs that hasn't cracked from the cold. You reach in and pull out what you need, your fingers turning stiff the moment they touch the air. Root cellars were the original refrigerators, cool in summer, not too frozen in winter, and protected from weather extremes. You dig them into hillsides when possible, or straight down if not. Walls reinforced with logs or stones, a sloped roof to shed water, and thick insulation made of straw, dirt or hay. Settlers learned fast that placing food above ground in winter was asking for trouble. The sun might warm it during the day, then freeze it solid overnight, over and over, until the contents were mush. or worse, exploded. In some parts of the West, especially where ice was more reliable than timber, folks went full-on icehouse. The concept was simple. Cut huge blocks of ice from a frozen river or lake in the dead of winter, drag them back to a pit or shed, and pack them in layers of sawdust and straw. The result? A freezing cold chamber that stayed usable well into spring, or longer if you were good at packing. Some homesteaders even shared community ice houses, carving out cubbies labelled with initials and trusting neighbours not to swipe each other's bacon. Quirky fact, sawdust was basically 1800s magic insulation. Cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly effective. It could keep ice from melting for months. One clever settler journaled about lining his cellar with sawdust and old wool scraps, claiming his butter stayed cold through to July, or at least until the neighbour boys sniffed it out. Of course, not everyone had access to a root cellar or ice house. Nomadic ranchers and frontier loners got creative. They'd stash food in canvas bags and hang them from tree branches to keep out scavengers. They'd bury meat in snowbanks, mark the spot with sticks, and hope it didn't attract wolves. In colder climates, meat froze naturally, sometimes too much. There are stories of people breaking their knives trying to cut a slab of frozen venison, then just throwing the whole thing in the fire to thaw it enough to cook. If you lived near a stream or river, you might build a crude cold box, a wooden crate submerged in flowing water, anchored by rocks. It acted like a giant cooler, keeping milk and perishables from freezing solid, even when air temperatures dropped below zero. You had to be careful, though. One misstep and you'd lose your week's provisions to the current, or worse, crack the ice and fall in yourself. Hypothermia wasn't just a risk. It was a full-time job avoiding it. Preservation was everything. Pickling, smoking, salting, drying. These weren't trends. They were lifelines. Every family had their own secret recipes, their own methods. Apple slices strung up to dry near the fire. Jerky cured on clotheslines. Beans sealed in cloth bags hung from the rafters. People would barter for preserves like they were currency, because in winter they were. And then there were the fails. The cellar that flooded and turned into an underground soup. The salted pork that spoiled from one bad batch of brine. The eggs that froze and cracked inside their shells, leaving you with sulphurous regrets. One woman wrote that her entire winter food stash was wiped out when a bear got into her dugout and ate everything but the coffee, and I wouldn't have blamed him if he drank that too. There's a debate among historians about how sustainable these early food storage methods really were. Some argue that many settlers starved quietly, without leaving behind dramatic records. Others suggest that communities came together to support each other more than we assume. The truth likely lives in both camps. Isolation could be deadly, but sometimes neighbours were the difference between survival and a spring funeral. You finish unpacking your provisions and head back inside, balancing a cloth-wrapped bundle of root vegetables, a tin of lard, and 2 frozen apples in your arms. The warmth of the cabin hits you like a slow exhale. You set everything down by the hearth and begin thawing what needs softening, moving with the kind of care that only comes from knowing how hard it was to get these supplies in the first place. Outside, the wind is shifting again. Snow drifts lazily against the walls, and you hear the distant creak of ice settling on the river. But in here, in this dim, smoky room, you've got food. Not much, not fancy, but enough. Enough to make soup, enough to stretch a few days further, enough to keep going. Because winter isn't just endured with fire and shelter, it's endured one root cellar raid at a time, one frozen potato at a time, one hard-earned meal you didn't think you'd still be around to eat. You ladle hot broth into your tin cup and sit close to the fire, sipping slowly, watching the ice melt off the apples by your feet. And just like that, winter loses another small battle. The cold has teeth today, sharp, unforgiving, and eager to bite through every layer you own. Even the fire feels timid, its glow barely pushing back the shadows in the corners of your cabin. You're used to the cold by now, in the way someone gets used to chronic pain or a difficult relative. You don't welcome it, but you know its moods. And today, it's bitter. It's mean. And if not for the women of winter, you'd probably be dead already. Frontier women, often romanticised as bonnet-wearing background characters, were, in reality, the glue, the engine, and the heating system of the household. They weren't just survivors. They were strategists, engineers, and insulation experts with a talent for keeping humans alive using almost nothing but scraps and sheer willpower. Let's be clear, the typical log cabin or dugout wasn't a spacious setup. One room, maybe two, and usually shared by an entire family. That meant limited firewood, limited privacy, and very limited warmth. It was the woman's job, by expectation, not choice, to keep the home functioning through months of snow, wind, and children with runny noses and frostbitten fingers. You think your socks are bad? Imagine trying to keep 6 children warm with one fire and a pile of mended quilts stitched from worn-out clothes. Women patched blankets until they were more thread than fabric. They stuffed cracks in the walls with bits of wool, rags, or paper. They hung quilts across doorways to block drafts, and in some cases, even draped them around beds to create little cocoon-like zones of warmth. Forget fancy bed frames. Ropes and pegs were used to string up blankets into makeshift warm rooms within rooms. And clothing? Everything was layered, patched, and repurposed. Old dresses became skirts. Worn trousers were cut into mittens. Women knitted constantly, by the fire, before dawn, after chores, whenever their hands weren't already holding a baby or a broom. Socks, scarves, shawls. You didn't just own warm clothes, you produced them. If the cabin had a chimney, it needed constant attention. Soot build-up could cause fires, and poorly vented stoves could fill a room with smoke in minutes. Women cleaned, adjusted, and maintained these heat sources while also cooking over them, often in freezing conditions. One journal entry from a Nebraska woman described how she had to boil beans, with gloves on, for the kitchen was no warmer than a barn, and the baby's tears froze on her cheeks. And they didn't just handle the warmth, they handled the food too. Root cellar runs, meal prep and rationing were everyday puzzles. Flour had to be kept dry, vegetables had to be monitored for rot, salt pork had to be kept away from the cat, the mice and the occasional hungry neighbour. Many women had a mental inventory of every single item in the house, down to the last dried bean. Nothing wasted. Ever. One fringe, quirky method women used for winter warmth: soapstone. Small dense blocks that could be heated in the fire and then tucked into beds, boots or cribs. Unlike hot water bottles, which froze or cracked, soapstone held its heat for hours and didn't leak. Some women would rotate 3 or 4 stones throughout the day, heating and reheating like prehistoric heating pads. Then there was the art of managing people. Cabin fever was real. Trapped indoors for months with restless kids, sick relatives, and one-room living meant tempers ran hot even if the weather didn't. It was often up to the woman of the house to keep peace, through storytelling, singing, prayer, or creative chore assignments. Some set strict schedules to keep everyone moving. Sweep, read, sew, wash, repeat. Others just gave in and let the children turn the place into chaos until the snow melted. One diary from a Wyoming homestead woman notes that the boys took to chasing the cat in circles for amusement, and by the 3rd week of snow I didn't care if they caught it. Another woman wrote, "My husband has spoken only 6 words in the last 4 days, all of them about beans." But this wasn't just about domestic survival. When needed, women went full engineer. They reinforced roofs, shoveled paths, fixed leaky chimneys, chopped wood when their husbands were gone or sick, and even built their own outbuildings. If the stove broke, they figured out how to jury-rig a fix. If the snow drifted over the front door, they dug tunnels, sometimes while carrying a baby on one hip and balancing a bucket of water on the other. And don't get it twisted, some women lived alone. Widows, homesteaders who struck out on their own, or those whose husbands never made it back from the last hunt. These women weren't just resourceful, they were borderline legendary. Stories spread of women shooting their own game, tanning hides in the snow, and surviving entire winters in cabins so isolated that the nearest neighbour was 2 days away by sled. Scholars debate how much of this labour was documented. Frontier women's voices were often left out of the larger history, their contributions mentioned only in passing. But their letters and diaries paint a fuller picture, one of relentless work, sharp minds and unbreakable grit. They weren't just keeping fires going, they were holding entire lives together while frost grew on the windows and wolves circled the barn. You glance around your cabin and realise how many things are still here because of those women. The wool blanket, the patched chair, the little shelf of preserved apples, the careful stack of firewood near the stove, smaller pieces first, ready for morning, details that make the difference between comfort and misery, between waking up rested and waking up numb. You pull the quilt tighter around your shoulders and throw another log on the fire. Outside, the snow is whispering against the walls again, soft but insistent. The wind is sharpening its voice, but in here, you're warm. Not just because of the fire, but because of everything wrapped around it. The things sewn, patched, stacked, and planned by the hands of someone who knew what winter really meant. It wasn't the storm that broke you. It was the little things you forgot to prepare for. And the women of the West, they never forgot. There's a sound in the middle of the night that brings you upright in an instant. One you've heard before, but hoped not to hear again. It's a high-pitched wheeze, followed by a weak cough. Then another. You sit up in your bedroll, scanning the dim glow from the coals in the hearth. It's not you, it's the kid. He's bundled tight in a pile of patchwork blankets, barely a lump in the corner, but the sound is unmistakable. He's sick. And this, perhaps more than blizzards or starvation or wolves, is the nightmare of a frontier winter. Children getting sick in a cabin with no doctor for 200 miles, and no medicine except whatever you can boil or pray over. Let's not sugarcoat it. Frontier winters were brutal on kids. Their small bodies, already underfed and overworked, stood little chance against weeks of freezing air, poor insulation, and endless drafts. And yet, there they were, learning to survive it anyway. Because children in the Wild West weren't tucked away from the struggle. They were in it, right beside the adults, chopping kindling with hatchets too big for their hands, hauling water through snowdrifts and sleeping two to a bed just to stay warm. You get up now, cross the room barefoot. Bad idea, the floor is ice. And kneel beside the boy. His forehead is warm, too warm. His breath rattles. You add more wood to the fire, wrap another blanket around him, and tuck the corners tight. You know there's not much more you can do but keep the fire going and hope his fever breaks by morning. That, and remember how kids like him got through winters before antibiotics, before thermometers, before anyone even called it pneumonia. Back then, sickness was expected. Fevers came and went like snowstorms. Coughs lingered for months. Babies were born in one corner of the cabin while a pot of beans simmered in the other. There were no separate rooms, no sterile gloves, just towels boiled in water and mothers with steady hands. When a child got sick, you made willow bark tea, rubbed bear grease on their chest, and hoped it wasn't the start of something worse. Still, kids had their own strange resilience. They knew how to nap under a quilt with frost forming on the inside of the walls. They played in the snow wearing coats 2 sizes too big and boots made of patched canvas. They helped haul firewood and carry water, and if they complained, they did it quietly. Not out of fear, but because it just wouldn't help. The West didn't leave room for softness, even in childhood. But they weren't joyless. Far from it. Kids invented games using what they had. They carved toys from scraps of wood, made sleds from barrel staves, and turned long icicles into pretend swords. They raced each other around the cabin, shrieking and laughing while adults yelled at them to sit still before they knocked over the stew pot. In the deepest part of winter, when it was too cold to play outside, they made up stories, sang songs or stage plays using their parents' boots as characters. One quirky tradition from frontier winters: button strings. Children would collect spare buttons throughout the year, stringing them into necklaces or long chains. Come winter, these became toys, decorations, even currency in cabin games. Some kids swore a long button string would bring good luck. Others used them to buy chores from siblings. It was part amusement, part superstition, and a surprisingly consistent feature in pioneer diaries. But no matter how tough or imaginative they were, children still got cold. Their fingers turned purple faster than adult hands. Their teeth chattered harder. And if the fire went out during the night, if the woodpile ran low or the wind snuck in through an unpatched crack, they'd wake up sick. Or worse. So frontier families made a habit of sleeping close. Sometimes all in one bed, sometimes lined up on the floor like burritos in blankets. Babies were swaddled tight and kept near the fire. Older kids were trained to help out, to stoke the coals, turn the soapstone, or rub their siblings' hands when they got too cold. Warmth became a family project. And when illness swept through, when it wasn't just one child coughing, but all of them, and maybe the parents too, the cabin became a hospital. Makeshift, of course, but no less serious. Blankets were aired out, water was boiled again and again, herbal remedies were brewed with grim determination. Mullein for coughs, horehound for congestion, chamomile to soothe fevers. If someone in the family knew a bit of midwifery or folk medicine, they became the doctor. Otherwise it was wait and hope. Historians argue about how high the child mortality rate was in remote frontier homesteads. Records are spotty. Some families lost half their children before the age of 10 and still carried on. Others seemed miraculously lucky. What's agreed on is this: the winter months were the deadliest. When disease hit, it hit hard. And yet, those who made it through, who grew up in cabins where you could see your breath indoors, often lived into old age with iron constitutions and stories that made their grandchildren blink in disbelief. You wipe the boy's forehead again. He's still warm, but breathing easier. The fire throws shadows across the wall, and you find yourself remembering the old trick. Heat a brick, wrap it in a towel, and lay it at the child's feet. You do exactly that. It doesn't fix anything, but it helps. Out here, that's all you can ask for. Outside, the snow has started again, soft and relentless. You know it'll be piling up fast, but inside, the cabin holds steady. You watch the child stir, shift, and then settle. You lean back, knees aching, and let the quiet fill the space. This is winter survival too. Not just the chopping of wood and the sealing of cracks, but the constant tending of fragile bodies. The sleepless nights. The whispered stories told just loud enough to distract a sick child from their coughing. The worn hand resting on a warm forehead, feeling for the moment when the fever breaks. You settle in beside the fire again, keeping watch. Because sometimes survival looks like hunting game in a blizzard, and sometimes it looks like staying up all night to make sure someone smaller than you keeps breathing. You've been up since before dawn, the fire down to orange coals and your eyes burning with sleep you didn't get. The boy's fever finally broke sometime around the middle of the night. He's sleeping now, still wrapped like a burrito in his pile of mended quilts, cheeks flushed but not burning. You stretch your arms and legs with a long, groaning exhale, then pour yourself a tin cup of lukewarm coffee that tastes like regret and ashes. Still it's hot, and hot wins every time out here. With the morning sun creeping through the frost-rimmed window, and your body too wired to rest, it's time to turn your thoughts to another subject. One that might feel like a joke at this point, but wasn't. Not really. Not when you needed something quick. Not when you had nowhere else to go. Let's talk about frontier architecture at its most improvised, absurd, and occasionally brilliant. Because sometimes you didn't have time, or the strength, for a full log cabin or dugout. Sometimes winter came early, or supplies ran out, or your horses bolted, taking the lumber with them, and when that happened, you got creative. And by creative, I mean you built the kind of shelter that made other settlers blink twice before saying, well, if it works. Start with the classic, the wagon house. If you were a homesteader crossing the plains and got caught by early snow, your covered wagon instantly became your house. Take off the wheels or leave them on. It didn't matter. You parked it in a slight depression if you could, built up snow or sod around the base, and tied everything down with a rope or desperation. Sometimes folks extended the wagon by adding canvas flaps on either side like makeshift wings. Others dropped the canvas altogether and covered the top with sod or thatch. The result? A strange hybrid of transportation and survival pod. Claustrophobic? Yes. Drafty? Absolutely. But many a pioneer spent entire winters sleeping in wagons, waking up with frost on their eyelashes and snow piled on the canvas above. Then there's the dugout wagon combo, a truly inspired piece of I give up but not quite design. You dig a shallow trench into the ground, just enough to lower the wagon's profile, and back the wagon down into it. Then you build up sod walls around the sides and let the earth do the insulating. The result? A slightly warmer, semi-buried shelter that looked like someone had parked a prairie schooner in the world's saddest culvert. People who lived in these setups tended to move out quickly come spring, but during blizzards, they were lifesavers. Still too fancy for your liking? Consider the sod tent, which is exactly what it sounds like. Start with canvas or hide stretched over a frame. Then, instead of leaving it bare, you pack sod over the top. Heavy? Oh yes. Likely to collapse? Also yes. But done correctly, a sod tent offered a surprisingly warm, earth-insulated interior, perfect for the miner who had absolutely no interest in cutting timber, but lots of time to haul dirt. Want something sturdier? Let me introduce you to the barrel shack. This one's rare but real. Some traders or railroad workers repurposed old shipping barrels, giant wooden casks used to transport food, nails, salt, or anything that fit, and transformed them into cylindrical living spaces. Stack 2 end to end, cut a door in one side, reinforce with tar paper, and boom! You've got a pioneer hobbit hole. Cosy, oddly effective, and just unstable enough to keep your blood pressure up during high winds. But the real crown jewel of weird winter shelters? The sod temple. Found mostly in parts of Kansas and Nebraska, these were large sod structures built with surprisingly grand ambitions. Think high ceilings, central support beams, even decorative flourishes made from carefully cut turf. Some families with multiple children went all out, constructing 2 or even 3-room sod homes with real door frames, windows with oiled paper panes, and lofts built into the upper corners. Sure, the walls might leak worms during rain, and yes, the smell was distinct, but these homes had one critical advantage: they stayed warm. Quirky historical note: one settler's journal from 1872 proudly described his sod home as cool in summer, warm in winter, and only occasionally full of snakes. Which, honestly, is a better review than most Airbnbs get today. Improvised shelters weren't just built from odd materials, they were born out of tight situations. Collapsed cabins, sudden storms, illness. People built lean-tos out of fence rails. They stretched old rugs between tree trunks. Some slept in their cellars, sealing the top with hay bales and lighting a single candle for warmth. Others burrowed into haystacks like overgrown mice, carving out tunnels and nests inside. In especially desperate cases, settlers dug straight down into the snow itself, creating snow caves lined with canvas and brush, trapping heat inside a bubble of white silence. There's debate among historians about how common these unconventional shelters were. Some argue they were outliers, last resorts for the unprepared or unlucky. Others point out the sheer number of journal entries, letters and photographs showing people surviving winter inside literal wagons or tents or patched-up crates. In truth, they were probably both, rare enough to seem strange, but common enough to prove that the frontier was one long improvisation contest with frostbite as the judge. You take a break from your coffee to tighten a seam in your cabin's back wall. It started to warp slightly from the snow pressing in on one side. You wedge a split log into place, hammer it down with the back of your axe and step back to admire your work. It's ugly, it's uneven, and it's holding, which makes it beautiful. Because that's what winter did to frontier builders. It stripped away ego, replaced design with function, and rewarded only the shelters that didn't collapse in the middle of the night. No one cared if your walls weren't square. They cared if you lived long enough to see spring. You return to the fire, pour yourself another cup of bitter black courage, and sit in your rickety chair with a creak. The boy is still sleeping peacefully. Outside, the wind howls through the trees, but your walls are solid, patched together from whatever you could find, held in place by mud and resolve. You take a slow sip, feel the warmth spread, and think. Not bad for something you built with scraps, desperation, and no formal training whatsoever. Frontier architecture. Ugly. Improvised. Life-saving. You step outside just after midday, the snow crunching under your boots like brittle sugar. The storm has passed, at least for now, and the air is heavy with that eerie calm that settles over the land when the wind finally shuts up. The sun is out doing its best impersonation of a warm celestial body, but it's just for show. Your breath still fogs instantly, and your coat feels stiff from where yesterday's snow froze into the fabric. You scan the horizon and spot something strange. Not smoke exactly, but a line of something rising in the distance, too consistent to be natural. Maybe it's a small fort or an old military outpost? You know it's not a homestead. Too square, too rigid. Probably built by the government, or maybe an abandoned trading post now turned to shelter. Either way, it gets you thinking. What did winter survival look like when it wasn't just a lone cabin with a leaky roof and a cold fire? Let's talk about forts, military outposts, and the uncomfortable marriage of logistics, bureaucracy, and brutal cold. Unlike the slapdash cabins of homesteaders, forts were often the best chance at halfway reliable winter housing on the frontier, especially for soldiers, scouts, and the occasional desperate traveller who managed to stumble in before the snow shut the doors for good. These weren't castles, mind you. Think more along the lines of rectangle-shaped walls, made of logs or adobe, enclosing a few sparse barracks, a storehouse, and a parade ground that no one had any business parading on in January. Inside the fort walls, the buildings were arranged with military neatness. Bunkhouses for enlisted men, officers' quarters, a mess hall, maybe a supply depot or blacksmith shop. Most buildings were log or sod-covered adobe, built low to the ground and tight to conserve heat. But just because they looked sturdy didn't mean they were. Barracks were notorious for being freezing. Poorly insulated, often built in a hurry and heated by a single stove, they were more like giant refrigerators with uniforms. Dozens of men would sleep in rows on narrow wooden bunks, pressed shoulder to shoulder under itchy wool blankets. In the worst forts, frost formed on the walls inside the room. Soldiers woke with beards frozen stiff, boots stuck to the floor, and the miserable realization that latrine duty still existed even in a blizzard. And yet, compared to sleeping in a snowbank, luxury. One little known fact: many forts were located in places that made absolutely no winter sense. They were placed there not because of shelter or water, but because of politics, along trade routes, on disputed territory, or near native settlements. That meant some outposts were built in windy plateaus, snow-choked valleys, or high elevations where trees were scarce, and storms rolled in like freight trains. So, soldiers had to build everything from scratch: barracks, mess halls, stables, even their own firewood supply chains. Firewood was gold in these places. Forts went through tons of it each winter, literally. Cutting, hauling, and stacking wood became a full-time job. If you were unlucky enough to get assigned to wood detail, you'd spend hours in the snow with an axe and a sled, praying you didn't lose a finger to frostbite before you got back. And then, you got to chop more, always more. But even with preparation, even with walls and supplies and regiments of shivering men, winter found its way in. The cold crept through the floorboards, snow blew in under doors, and the boredom could eat a man alive. There's only so much you can do when you're trapped for months inside 4 log walls with the same dozen faces, the same cold gruel, and the same stale jokes. Officers had it better. Their quarters were slightly warmer, with private stoves and rugs to cover the floors. Some even had bookshelves, desks, or small collections of brandy smuggled in under the nose of command. One officer's journal from Fort Benton describes throwing parties during snowstorms just to keep the men from losing their minds and strangling each other. That's not an exaggeration. Cabin fever in forts was a real threat. Fights broke out, gambling got out of hand. There were stories of men eating through all the rations for the week by Wednesday and having to spend the rest of it gnawing on boot leather or diluted soup. Morale dropped. Desertions happened. And sometimes, people simply disappeared, out into the snow, maybe chasing a hallucination of spring. Then there were the makeshift forts, trading posts or scout stations fortified just enough to pretend they were official. These were often built by civilians or fur companies, and while smaller, they shared many traits with army posts: tight quarters, smoke-choked rooms, and a communal approach to warmth. Here too the hearth became the heart of the space, one fire to heat the entire room. If it went out, everyone suffered. Quirky architectural feature. Forts often had sod-covered roofs, even on the interior buildings. Not because they looked nice, they didn't, but because sod acted like insulation and fireproofing. Soldiers would sometimes climb up during snowstorms to knock off excess weight, or to patch leaks with more mud. It was less fortified structure, and more mud igloo with muskets. And yet, people survived. They learned tricks: double-layered socks, heated bricks under blankets, hanging wet clothes near the stove on makeshift lines made of wire or gut. Soldiers learned to roll themselves into their blankets like human tamales, tucking in every edge to hold the heat. And the more experienced among them carved wind blocks outside doors, stacked hay bales along exterior walls, and even dug shallow trenches around buildings to direct melting snow away from the foundation come spring. Scholars sometimes debate whether forts were truly safer in winter than cabins. Sure, they had more people and more supplies, but they also had more mouths to feed, more egos to navigate, and more bodies packed into tight, cold spaces. Diseases like influenza, dysentery, and scurvy spread fast, especially with low rations and high stress. Some winters, forts lost a dozen men without ever firing a shot. Still, if you stumbled out of the snow and into a frontier fort, fingers numb, stomach empty, boots soaked through, it must have felt like finding sanctuary, warmth, soup, maybe even music if someone still had a fiddle and fingers thawed enough to play it. You glance back toward your cabin now, a small silhouette against the white. It's not a fort. It doesn't have barracks or officers or stacks of firewood guarded like treasure, but it's yours. It's warm. It doesn't have a chain of command, it has coffee, and that might just be better. You head back across the snow, wind rising again at your back. You pass a line of animal tracks, rabbit or coyote, and pause just long enough to listen. The silence is deep, heavy, but not empty. Not anymore. Inside, the fire is still crackling. The boy stirs. You hang your coat, stamp snow off your boots, and close the door against the cold once more. Outside, the west is still wild. Inside, you've carved a little order from it. You're out of flour. You knew it yesterday, suspected it 2 days ago, and ignored it a full week before that. But today it's official. No more biscuits, no more dumplings, no more dusting the skillet with something that almost feels like civilization. You stare at the empty tin as if it might change its mind, then let out a long breath and lean back against the table. The fire is still burning, the cabin walls are holding, and the boy is sitting up and eating without coughing every 2 minutes. But you're running low on more than flour. You're running low on everything: wood, salt, patience. Winter has dug in deep and you're starting to feel the pinch. So today you do what many in the Wild West did when they hit that same wall. You set out toward communal shelter, a neighbour's homestead, a shared barn, a trading post, maybe even a church if it's still standing and someone's been tending the fire. Because when your supplies get tight, your luck gets thin, and your sanity starts to creak. Sometimes the only way to make it through the winter is to huddle up with other human beings and try not to murder each other. You bundle up, tie a scarf tight around your face, and check the boy. Still warm, still tired, but stable. You leave him tucked in, with clear instructions to keep the fire going and not to burn the cabin down. Then you step outside into the kind of cold that cuts through wool like a knife through pie crust. The snow is deep, past your knees, and you follow a frozen trail you've walked a dozen times before, boots crunching, every breath visible and hard-won. You're heading to a place you've been to before, an old trading post turned impromptu gathering hall about a mile away. It's not much, half a roof, 3 walls, and a chimney that belches more smoke inside than out. But it's better than nothing. That's the bar out here, better than nothing. In the early days of settlement, communal spaces were built not because people were particularly social, but because they were necessary. Trading posts, general stores, and feed barns often doubled as winter shelters when individual homes failed to hold. If your roof collapsed under snow, or your firewood supply ran dry, or your cabin caught fire because your 6-year-old threw a spark into the straw pile, as 6-year-olds do, you gathered up your family and your remaining possessions and trudged to wherever the heat was. Inside the trading post now, the door groans open on its hinges. Warmth greets you, uneven and smoky but real. A few others have beaten you here. There's a woman in the corner knitting with fingers too red to move quickly, a ranch hand asleep on a pile of grain sacks, and 2 old men arguing about whether this year's winter is worse than the last one. It always is. No one greets you with surprise. Everyone understands why you're here. You nod, stamp off the snow, and make your way to the back where supplies are pooled. It's an informal system. You give what you can, take what you need, and try not to be greedy. There's some flour, a few withered onions, half a jar of molasses that someone forgot to seal properly. You leave a pouch of dried beans from your last harvest, and take just enough flour to make a batch of biscuits, just enough to buy 1 more day. Communal living in winter wasn't glamorous. It was cramped, smoky, and noisy. Every cough echoed. Every argument turned into a minor soap opera. Babies wailed at all hours. Dogs snuck food off plates. But it was survival. In shared spaces like these, people traded not just food, but skills. Stories, news, sewing needles, mended boots, and sometimes just the comfort of hearing someone else complain about their situation louder than you did. One quirky but practical system used in some communities, the rotating fire watch. In any communal shelter, someone had to keep the fire going all night. Rather than let it die, and risk waking up frozen, residents took turns sitting by the stove, feeding it kindling, and trying not to fall asleep. In some outposts, they'd use a tin pan tied to a string. If you dozed off, it clattered to the floor and shamed you back into consciousness. Mildly humiliating, yes. Effective? Definitely. Of course, not every community pulled together. There were those who hoarded supplies, locked their cabins tight, and refused to share. Others got territorial, especially when resources ran thin. One historical account tells of a family that built a false front on their cellar door to hide it from desperate neighbours. Another story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, describes a man who traded his last bag of oats for a working shotgun because he knew exactly how desperate the weeks ahead would be. Historians still debate how widespread communal living really was in winter. Some argue it was rare, a last resort only used when the situation was beyond bad. Others say it was quietly common, an informal safety net between scattered settlers who understood the unspoken rule. Don't let your neighbour die if you can help it, especially not in January. You take a moment to sit down on a crate near the fire. Someone hands you a chipped mug of something hot and not entirely unpleasant. You sip it, grateful. The room buzzes with quiet noise. Knitting needles clicking, boots scuffing, a spoon stirring a pot of stew that smells like it might have started as squirrel and ended as miracle. No one speaks much. No one needs to. This silence isn't awkward. It's shared. Eventually you stand, thank the room with a nod, and tuck your pouch of flour back under your coat. You make the walk home slower this time, weighed down by both the cold and the strange comfort of having been around people, not friends, not family, but others, alive, enduring. Back at your cabin, the boy is awake, poking at the fire with more enthusiasm than skill. He looks up and grins when he sees you, and you pull off your coat and ruffle his hair before setting the flour down on the table. You'll make biscuits tonight, maybe even stew if you can find something edible in the cellar that doesn't crunch from frost. And while your walls are still thin and the wind still howls through the cracks, something feels stronger now. You've stepped out of the solitude, shared warmth, shared supplies, shared a nod with someone else dragging their bones through another frozen day. Sometimes that's all winter gives you, and sometimes it's enough. The biscuits turned out flat and a little bitter, but you ate them anyway. The boy ate too and went back for more, which either means he's feeling better or his taste buds have surrendered to frontier life. Either way, you'll take it. There's a heat to the cabin tonight, not just from the fire, but from the quiet satisfaction of having enough. Just enough flour, enough wood, enough quiet. But it won't last, because tomorrow's problem is already bubbling beneath the surface. Water. You've known it was coming. The barrel outside, once overflowing with rain and snowmelt, is now a solid cylinder of ice. The creek nearby, frozen so thick you could drive a wagon across it, if you had one. And the well? If you even have one, it's likely capped with a foot of ice and barely giving you more than a trickle. Out here, water is everywhere, and somehow completely unreachable. So tomorrow, you'll do what everyone out here does in the depths of winter. You'll wrestle your drinking water from ice. You start early. The sun's not even up when you crack open the cabin door and step into the bite. The sky's pink at the edges, the air razor sharp. You grab the axe and head toward the creek, boots crunching over snow and buried brush. Each breath stings. You know the drill. Hack through the ice, haul what you can, and try not to fall in, because if you do, you're dead. Frozen creeks are deceptive. The top layer might be a foot thick, but underneath it the water still flows, slow, cold, and uncaring. You've chopped through before. First comes the thin layer of powdery frost, then the clear sheet, smooth and hard, then the layer of slush just above the water. Each strike of the axe rings through the still morning air. You sweat under your coat, even as your nose goes numb. Eventually the blade bites through, and cold water bubbles up, dark and menacing. You scoop it fast, a bucket, maybe two, then you pack snow into canvas sacks to melt later. Because yes, you can drink melted snow, but it's a terrible plan if that's your only option. Snow is mostly air. It takes forever to melt and barely gives you enough to wet your lips, let alone cook or wash or hydrate properly. But it's something, so you bring both, snow and water, and trudge back, shoulders aching and beard rimed with frost. Inside, you dump the snow into the iron pot on the fire. Slowly it slumps, becoming a sad grey puddle. You add the creek water to another pot, watching for sediment or floating bits of twig, or worse. Some settlers boiled everything just to be safe. Others didn't bother and paid for it later with dysentery, parasites, or a winter spent doubled over with gut rot and regret. Not all frontier homes had creeks nearby. Those folks used wells, if they had the tools to dig one. Shallow ones froze fast, often requiring daily chopping just to get a cupful. Deeper ones were better, but harder to dig and harder to draw from when the rope iced over or the crank mechanism froze in place. People got creative. Heated rocks dropped into buckets to thaw them. Metal pails stored upside down to keep snow out. Some even built little wooden well huts to shield the top from the wind. And if none of that worked, You melted ice, chipped it off rocks, collected icicles like strange glass carrots, and fed them into a boiling pot one by one. Some families rigged clever systems, canvas snow catchers sloped into barrels, or gutters that channeled meltwater off the roof when the rare sun came out. A few had cisterns under the floorboards, insulated by dirt and fire heat. Those were rare, ingenious, life-saving. One odd but effective technique. People would bury barrels or buckets of water inside the house, often near the fire to keep them from freezing. In tight quarters, it worked. But you had to be careful. Too close to the fire and you had steam and condensation, which led to damp everything. Too far and it froze solid again, trapping your ladle like Excalibur in a block of ice. Quirky historical tidbit. There's at least one recorded instance of a pioneer family using a hollowed-out cowhide as a portable water bladder during winter. It was disgusting. It was effective. The kind of solution only desperation or genius could inspire. Water wasn't just for drinking. You needed it to cook, wash, and keep basic hygiene. You needed it for animals, too, who didn't take kindly to being served snow cones in place of drinking water. Ranchers would often chop holes in frozen ponds and haul water by bucket to the barn, sometimes 5, 10, 15 trips a day. A single cow could drink over 10 gallons in freezing weather. Multiply that by a herd and you had a full-time job on your hands. In some places, ranchers built makeshift stock tank heaters using metal barrels and coal, just to keep the water from icing over. Not fancy, but it worked. And when water ran out completely, you rationed. You cooked with snow. You stopped bathing altogether. You wiped dishes with cloth and hoped no one got sick. Some families bathed once a week, others once a month, or less. It wasn't about luxury. It was about conservation. The phrase, "don't waste water," wasn't a polite suggestion. It was survival etiquette. Modern historians debate how serious the water issue really was. Some argue that with proper planning, most settlers had enough from creeks, snow and wells. Others point to the diaries and letters full of complaints, frozen barrels, cracked kettles, water that smelled like rotting leaves. The truth, probably a mix of both. Some families had systems, others had accidents, some had both, and just got lucky. You stir your pot of melted snow now, the water steaming faintly. The boy watches from his corner, blanket around his shoulders, eyes clearer today. You ladle some into a cup and hand it to him. He takes it with both hands and drinks slowly. It's not tea, it's not coffee, it's just warm water, but it might as well be nectar. You look over at your remaining firewood and make a mental note. Another trip out tomorrow. More chopping, more hauling, more ice to break and snow to scoop. But for now, you've got a warm room, a hot cup, and the day's water pulled from beneath a sheet of frozen death. Out here, that counts as winning. You've barely gotten the ice off your coat and your gloves thawed near the fire before the silence outside shifts. It's not louder, just different. A stillness so sharp it puts your nerves on edge, like something holding its breath. You step out onto the porch, squinting across the bright white world. No wind, no birds, no movement, just you, the snow, and the unsettling realization that you're being watched. Or maybe not watched, sized up. Because out in those hills, tucked between frost-laced trees and ridges, someone is surviving this winter alone, on purpose, and doing it better than you ever could. Enter the mountain men, the solo survivalists of the Wild West, the weird, wool-wrapped legends who built snug winter shelters miles from the nearest soul, and managed to outlive both the elements and their own reputations. It takes a certain kind of person to live this way. Not just stubborn, not just resourceful, fierce. The kind of person who sees a snowstorm roll in and thinks, perfect, just what I needed. These men, and a few women too, left civilization behind not out of necessity but preference. They weren't running from winter, they were embracing it. Their shelters were small, minimal, but expertly made. The classic choice? The trapper's cabin, a one-room log hut built with surgical precision. Notched logs stacked tight, thick moss or clay packed into every gap, and a roof low enough to trap heat but high enough not to smack your forehead every time you stood up. The door was small too, often hung on wooden pegs or hide straps. Windows, if they existed at all, were covered with greased paper or leftover hide, more to keep animals out than let light in. And these weren't just homes, they were fortresses of solitude, tucked beside rivers, built into rock faces, hidden beneath pine-covered slopes. The only sign of life might be a wisp of smoke curling from a rock chimney or the faint trail of snowshoe prints leading off into nowhere. You didn't find a mountain man's cabin by accident. You found it because he let you. Once inside, these cabins were marvels of minimalism. A bed built from pine boughs and hides, a stone hearth lined with blackened cookware, hooks along the walls for drying meat, hanging traps, or keeping tools off the ground. In the corner, a stash of dried beans, jerky, and maybe a bottle of something strong enough to strip paint. Warmth came from a small fire and layers upon layers of furs: buffalo, deer, beaver. If it moved and had a pelt, it got turned into insulation. Some mountain men went full primitive engineer. They built dugout shelters into riverbanks, complete with smoke holes and clever drainage ditches. Others constructed lean-tos with layered bark roofs and walls so tightly packed with snow and brush they felt like you were inside a beaver lodge. And yes, some lived in actual caves, modifying them with stones, brush, and the occasional luxury item like a wooden floor or a cot lifted from an abandoned camp. But here's the part that'll really bake your frozen potato. Many of them thrived. They weren't barely hanging on. They were hunting, trapping, preserving, writing journals, crafting snowshoes, and occasionally hosting other trappers for stew and stories. Solitude didn't scare them. Noise did. If a mountain man heard too much human activity, he packed up and moved further into the wild. Winter didn't chase him out. People did. One fringe fact you probably didn't expect. Some mountain men brought books into the wilderness. Not many, and not always complete. But Bibles, Shakespeare, dime novels, dog-eared, soot-stained treasures that they read over and over on long frozen nights. More than one journal mentions the strange comfort of hearing Hamlet's monologues echoing off snow-covered cliffs, spoken aloud by a man wearing fur boots and eating cold beans from a tin. Still, the life wasn't romantic. It was cold, dangerous. Medical emergencies were handled with whiskey, grit, and hope. A bad cut or broken limb could mean a slow death by infection. If food ran low, there was no neighbour to ask, no town to ride into, just you and whatever you'd stashed for the lean times. Trapping slowed in the deep cold, and hunting required energy many didn't have to spare. That meant heavy reliance on preserved goods: pemmican, dried berries, smoked meat. Anything you didn't kill before the first snow might as well have been a ghost. Fire was survival. Mountain men often built fire pits lined with stone, using coals banked under ash to keep a slow heat overnight. Starting from scratch each day wasn't an option. Flint and steel took time. Matches were scarce. Banking coals and protecting the fire like a sacred flame became a ritual. Some even slept with a hot rock in their bedroll, wrapped in cloth or tucked under hides. An old trick, but one that kept more than a few men from freezing to death. Scholars debate whether the image of the lone mountain man is myth or truth. Some argue that even the most rugged trappers relied heavily on native knowledge, trading networks, and occasional supply drops. Others maintain that a select few truly did vanish into the wild for years at a time, emerging only when spring thawed the trails and they felt like saying hello to the world again. You're inclined to believe both. No one survives the Wild West winter alone without learning from those who came before. And no one builds a life out here without a little help. Even if that help is a half-remembered lesson, a fur-lined trick passed down from someone who knew the land better than you ever will. As you head back toward your own cabin, the cold creeping up your spine, you catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of your eye. A shape at the edge of the trees. A person? A trick of the light? Hard to say, but you know better than to shout. If someone's out there, really out there, they'll decide if they want to be seen. You reach your door and duck inside. The fire's still burning, the boys are asleep again, and the cabin smells faintly of pine smoke and thawing boots. You hang your coat, rub warmth back into your fingers, and sit down with a long exhale. You're not a mountain man, not yet. But you're starting to understand why some people choose the quiet, the space, the self-reliance, and why, in the deep of winter, a warm shelter you built with your own hands might be the only piece that matters. The wind changes overnight. It doesn't howl anymore. It hums, low and mean, like it's stalking something. Maybe you. The snow outside has hardened into jagged crusts, and the sky is back to that leaden grey that tells you another storm is brewing. Crouch just beyond the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. You patch the stove's flue again with a bit of old shirt, shift the firewood pile a little closer to the hearth, and wrap the boy tighter in his blanket bundle before you sit down to think. Not about food this time, or water, or even the roof. No, this morning you're thinking about wind. Because fire keeps you alive, but wind tries to make you forget you ever were. Out here, winter wind is not a gentle breeze or a poetic gust. It's a force of erasure. It doesn't just move snow around, it shapes the land, fills in the path you just cleared 5 minutes ago, tears shingles off your roof, works its icy fingers into every crack of your shelter, and rattles your bones from the inside out. If fire is survival's light, wind is death's breath. So today's job? Windproofing, the old-fashioned way. You begin with the windows. Yours are crude, wax paper stretched over a square cut into the logs, held in place with wooden slats and a prayer. Wind chews at the corners. You take a roll of cloth, scraps from a ruined apron maybe, and start packing it along the edges. Some settlers used wool, others moss. You use whatever you can get your hands on that doesn't freeze stiff. A couple of nails, a bit of hide, anything to stop the whistling. Then you move to the door. It's just a slab of wood hung on leather hinges, and it leaks cold like a sieve. You tack up another blanket, one of your good ones unfortunately, but that's the way it goes. Some families use buffalo hide as inner curtains, others stitch together sacks, feed bags or old quilts. A thick layer of something, even if it's ugly as sin, makes the difference between a livable cabin and a box of regret. And then the pièce de résistance, snow. You step outside, wrap your scarf up to your eyes and start shoveling. Not to clear the path, to pile snow against the cabin. Sounds backwards, right? But out here, snow is your insulation. If you stack it just right, packed tight along the lower walls, it forms a natural windbreak. Keeps the drafts from crawling under the floorboards and slows the wind's bite before it gets to your door. It's counterintuitive, brilliant, free, and it works. One quirky trick you try today? Stuffing rags soaked in lard into the window frame. It smells awful, like a sweaty pig on a hot day, but it blocks air like a charm, and the scent fades. Eventually, maybe. Historically, settlers came up with all kinds of weird but effective windproofing methods. In dugouts, they'd carve grooves into the dirt walls to wedge in extra boards or hang heavy rugs. In sod houses, they'd pack fresh mud into cracks after every freeze-thaw cycle. In cabins, people hung wind cloths, long strips of canvas or linen tacked around the ceiling's edges, fluttering to show where drafts slipped in. If it moved, it needed sealing. If it stayed still, you'd done your job. Some even went so far as to build double walls, creating a slim pocket of air between the logs and an interior lining of canvas or rough wood. It wasn't much, but air, still air, is an excellent insulator. It's why some folks slept inside tents inside their cabins. You picture that now, a family of 6 zipped up in a makeshift canvas cocoon while the wind howled like wolves outside. Cozy? Not exactly, but warm enough to live another day. One common tool for windproofing? Animal hides, nailed across doors, windows, even the ceiling. Soft, tough, and remarkably wind-resistant. Deer, elk, buffalo. If it had fur and wasn't currently being eaten, it was probably nailed to a wall somewhere. Some cabins looked like inside-out beasts lined with skin and held together with sinew and sheer stubbornness. You finish your rounds, cloth in the corners, snow packed outside, blanket over the door, and sit back down inside the cabin. It's quieter now, not warm but less cruel. The wind still taps at the walls like a salesman who knows you're home but won't take the hint. But it doesn't get in, not easily. The boy stirs and you hand him a cup of warm broth. He's stronger today, colour back in his cheeks, and he offers a half smile that says, "I know it's awful, but thanks." You nod. That's enough. Out here, you take your victories in fractions. Windproofing wasn't a one-time task, it was constant maintenance, a ritual. Every storm peeled something back, every thaw made new cracks. Families checked their shelters daily, hourly even. The smell of smoke inside wasn't just from the fire, it was the absence of outside air. That thick, musty warmth, that was safety. If your cabin didn't stink a little, you probably had a hole somewhere. Some scholars debate how effective these techniques were. Diaries mention freezing indoors, as casually as others might describe a rainy day. But just as many settlers survived using nothing more than dirt, cloth, and a strong sense of what a cold wind could do to a tired body. In truth, most folks lived in homes that were just good enough, not airtight, Not warm by any modern standard, but windproof enough to matter. You watch as the steam from your cup rises, curling into the air without being yanked sideways by a draft. That's how you know the work paid off. There's no sudden tug of cold, no invisible claw wrapping around your neck, just stillness, controlled air, a fire that heats instead of fights. You wrap yourself in a blanket and lean back against the wall, eyes closed, the wind still moaning outside but quieter now, like it knows it's not welcome. The walls creak, but they hold. The snow packs tighter against the logs, the fire crackles and spits, and for the first time in days your toes don't feel like they're going to fall off. You survived another fight with the wind, and you'll fight it again tomorrow, but tonight, you rest, because you've got your shelter, your heat, and your silence. And out here, silence means the wind lost. It starts as a hiss, barely louder than the crackle of the fire, and you almost ignore it. But then comes the pop, sharp and mean, and then the unmistakable scent of burning wool. You're out of your chair before your brain catches up, kicking the edge of the blanket that started to smoulder near the hearth. One more inch, and that thing would have gone up like a haystack in July. You stomp it out, coughing through the smoke, heart pounding. That's the thing about winter in the Wild West. If the cold doesn't get you, the fire probably will. You sit back down once the danger is dealt with, eyes darting around the room. Everything's safe again, but just barely. And now you can't stop thinking about the delicate balance of staying warm without accidentally dying in the process. A cosy fire, yes, but not too cosy. Hot coals, yes, but not that close to your only blanket. This is the frontier version of living dangerously. One part frozen toes, one part burning cabin. Let's talk about the tightrope walk that was staying warm without lighting yourself, or your shelter, on fire. The average Wild West stove wasn't some elegant cast-iron showpiece. It was a box of steel with a pipe jammed through the wall and a door that didn't quite latch. Heat? Yes. Control? Not so much. These things radiated warmth like a sun on a bad day. One side would be glowing cherry red, and the other barely warm. People would crowd around it in shifts, rotating like chickens on a spit to avoid burning on one side while freezing on the other. And the hazards? Endless. Sparks would leap from the open stove door. Wood too dry would crack and spit embers. Chimney flues would clog with soot and start backdrafts that smoked up the entire room. One wrong move and your blanket, curtain, coat or cat could go up in flames. Not metaphorically, literally. Still, people got crafty. Fire safety wasn't a concept so much as a daily routine. Buckets of water sat nearby, always full. Blankets were folded and kept low, far from sparks. You didn't drape anything near the stove unless you wanted to wake up to the smell of roasted shirt sleeve. Most cabins had a fire zone, a sacred circle of scorched floorboards, always cleared, always watched. You reach under your bed now and pull out the old metal bed warmer, a shallow pan with a handle, once used for scooping hot coals and sliding them between sheets to preheat the bed. You've used it twice. Both times nearly set the mattress on fire. Now it lives under there, mostly as a warning. For many, it wasn't beds that were the issue. It was boots. People used to dry their footwear too close to the fire, especially after a day's slogging through slush and snow. Leather stiff as bark would soften just enough to be wearable, unless you left it an inch too close. Then it would crack, warp, or straight up ignite. More than one homesteader woke to the smell of smouldering moccasins. Then there were the children. Oh, the children and fire. Kids with cold fingers, kids with curiosity, kids who didn't understand that a red-hot stove was not to be poked with sticks, spoons, or, once, infamously, a frozen potato which exploded and shot chunks of starch across the room. You think you've got parenting stress. Try raising 4 kids in a one-room cabin with an open flame and no backup plan. Quirky historical footnote, toasted socks. Yes, settlers actually coined the phrase. It wasn't about flavour. It was a common trick. Hang your socks by the fire overnight to dry, but if you weren't careful, they'd crisp like bacon and crumble to ash. Some folks swore by draping them over a stick. Others built elaborate sock-drying rigs from branches and string. It became a sort of cultural detail, a shared winter joke. Don't toast your socks, they'd say, meaning don't get cocky just because you're warm for a second. But even when you were careful, there was always the threat of chimney fires, a build-up of soot and creosote, thick, oily stuff that coated the inside of your flue could catch fire if the stove got too hot. No smoke detectors, No fire department. Just you, a bucket of snow, and maybe a quilt to beat out the flames. Some settlers even rattled chains down the chimney weekly, dragging heavy knots of iron through the soot to knock it loose. Not because they enjoyed it, but because they'd seen what happened when someone didn't. Then there were the midnight fires, not the ones in your stove, but the ones in your bedding. You'd fall asleep warm, body pressed close to a stone or a soap-heated brick, only to wake up sweating and smelling smoke. Or worse, not wake up. Stories drifted from camp to camp, someone who died in their sleep, someone who rolled too close to the coals, someone whose dog kicked over a candle and didn't live to bark about it. And yet, freezing was still the bigger threat. Hypothermia wasn't well understood, but everyone knew what it looked like. Grey skin, slurred speech, a tiredness so deep it felt like peace, right before it turned permanent. People would do dangerous things to stay warm, sleep too close to the fire, use gasoline to start the stove, burn green wood that popped like gunfire. Because a bad fire might kill you quick, but the cold would kill you slowly. Historians argue over how many cabins burned down in the average winter. The records are vague, the fires often unreported, the bodies buried in spring. But the consistent detail across journals, letters, and oral histories? Fear. Fear of the fire, fear of the cold, fear of making one wrong move in the middle of the night. You check your stove now. The coals are glowing just right. The pot on top lets off a steady hiss of steam. The boy is wrapped up, sleeping soundly, far enough from the fire to be safe but close enough to stay warm. You hang your socks, not too close, and adjust the iron plate that reflects heat into the room. You sit down, stretch your legs toward the hearth, and let the warmth seep into your bones. It's dangerous, yes, but it's also life. You could be cautious, or you could be cold. Out here, you learn how to live in the sliver of space between those two extremes, and tonight, you live right there, in the flickering glow between the frost and the flame. It begins with a sound like nothing, just a faint hiss, the kind you might mistake for the wind slipping through the eaves. Then comes the tap-tap-tap against the roof, as if the sky is slowly emptying a bag of rice onto your cabin. And then, all at once, the world disappears. The window vanishes behind a wall of white. The door creaks with sudden pressure, and the hum outside turns into a low, steady roar. You step back from the window, heart thudding. Because you know what's coming now. Blizzard, full strength, no holding back. This is the worst-case scenario, the one you've been building toward for months. You've chopped wood until your arms went numb, sealed the walls with snow and fabric, stockpiled flour, beans, salt and firewood, double-checked every crack, nailed every loose board. But even with all that, a multi-day storm is something else entirely. It's not just about surviving the cold anymore, it's about surviving time, because blizzards on the frontier didn't last hours. Sometimes they lasted days. You double-bar the door, brace it with a length of firewood, and add 2 more logs to the fire. The room dims slightly as the snow starts to pile up over the windows, cutting off the meagre grey light. It's midday, but it might as well be midnight. And the wind? It's not screaming like before. Now it growls. Deep, constant, hungry. You glance at the boy. He's awake, wide-eyed, sitting up under the blankets. He knows too. There's nothing to do now but wait, watch, and manage your resources like you're the quartermaster of a sinking ship. Let's be clear, you're not going outside. Not in this. People died 5 feet from their front door during storms like these, lost in a whiteout they thought they could walk through. You've read the stories, heard the warnings. Farmers tied ropes from their cabin door to the barn just to find their way during feeding time. Some froze clutching those ropes, just feet from safety. So you stay in. You stay in. And now you meet the true challenge of a frontier blizzard. The slow crawl of time. First comes the cold. Not the creeping kind from before, but sudden, sharp plunges every time the wind shifts. You check for drafts obsessively. Your fingers find tiny cracks near the window you'd missed before. You stuff them with cloth, repack snow on the outside wall, move the boy's bedding a little close to the fire. You don't let the stove go dim, not for a second. Then comes the dark. Even with a fire, the room takes on this cave-like gloom. Smoke curls against the low ceiling. You light a candle, then quickly blow it out. Save it. Candles don't grow on trees, and neither do matches. You learn to let your eyes adjust to make peace with shadows. By day 2, your nerves start to fray. You've got food, enough to ration. But how long will this last? Your woodpile's dwindling. The snow packed against the door is now halfway up the window. You don't say it aloud, but the thought slinks into your brain. What if it lasts longer? This is where you understand why pioneers told stories. Why journals from the period are filled with long, rambling tales and nonsense songs scribbled into the margins. When the wind screams for hours and the walls moan back, you need something louder inside your head. So you talk to the boy, tell him stories, some real, some made up. He listens. He laughs once. That helps. You take turns sleeping, but it's not restful. The cabin creaks. The fire crackles too low. The wind finds new ways to make noise, scratching at the door, howling through the stovepipe, tapping against the roof in patterns that start to feel like someone walking across it. You remember a journal entry you read once, written by a woman trapped during the Great Storm of 1888. She wrote, "We dared not open the door, for it would not close again. The wind had nails in it. You understand now. It does feel like nails. Every gust slams against the walls like a hammer. You eat sparingly, a little stew, a chunk of bread, melted snow for water. You feed the boy first, then yourself. Your stomach rumbles but doesn't ache. Hunger feels manageable. It's the waiting that's harder." One bizarre fringe strategy from the time: snow blankets. Some settlers actually packed snow inside their entryways, blocking off rooms or sections of the cabin to create a smaller, warmer living space. Snow, once packed and frozen, can act like insulation. Strange, but smart. You try it, pushing snow into the doorway gap to stop the draft. It helps. Historians debate how common blizzard deaths really were. Some claim they were overstated, used to dramatize frontier life. Others argue the opposite, that many deaths went unrecorded, or were simply chalked up to missing when spring came and someone's cabin stayed quiet. Either way, one fact isn't in question. Blizzards isolated people completely. No help was coming, no rescue was riding in. It was just you and your choices, 1 hour at a time. By the third day the wind changes again, not softer, just slower, like it's tired or bored. The snow still falls, but it's gentler now, sifting instead of slamming. You peel back the cloth from the window and see light. Real light. A pale sun trying to climb its way through the grey. You risk cracking the door, it resists, frozen shut. You chip at it with the edge of a pan, then a knife. Eventually you shove it open a few inches. The snow spills in, thigh deep and heavy. You blink into the brightness. It's blinding, still, silent. Like the storm never happened, but you know it did. You step outside for the first time in 3 days. Everything is buried. The woodpile, the path, the trees bend under the weight of snow, heavy and quiet. No birds, no wind, just you, your boots crunching into the top layer and the awareness that you made it. Back inside, the boy's asleep again, curled near the hearth like a cat. You stoke the fire, pour the last of the morning's water, and sit beside it. You're bone-tired, smoked out, half mad from cabin shadows and wind ghosts. But you're alive, and after a storm like that, that's the most you can ask for. You spend the next few days digging. It's the kind of work that feels like it's never going to end, shoveling snow just to uncover more snow. You clear the path to the outhouse, or at least where you think the outhouse is. You chip open the well cover. You even dig out the barn, though the door's warped from the weight and hangs sideways on one hinge. Every motion aches. Every breath puffs white into the air and freezes on your scarf. But it's the aftermath now, and that means one thing: time to rebuild. You never really think about it when winter begins. You imagine cold nights and fireside stew, maybe even the quiet charm of snow falling on pine trees. But by the time it's March, or sometimes even later, and the thaw creeps in, that's when you remember what winter really does. It breaks things, cracks them, warps them, crushes them. Winter isn't just a season, it's a slow wrecking ball. And now, with the worst of the snow starting to melt in patchy icy sheets, you begin to take stock of what's still standing, and what isn't. Your cabin, for one, has seen better days. The roof has bowed inward. Not a full collapse, not yet, but it's holding on with the stubbornness of a drunk on his third warning. You climb up there with a shovel and a hoe, careful to distribute your weight, and start peeling off snow in uneven slabs. Underneath, the shingles have curled. Some are missing. The pitch is off. The corner seams pulled apart by ice that expanded and contracted every time the temperature shifted. You patch what you can, using spare boards, leftover cloth, and one remarkably flat skillet whose handle broke off back in January. This is the part no one tells you about when they romanticize frontier life. The rebuilding, the constant maintenance, how nothing you build stays built, especially after it's spent 3 months under snow that weighs as much as a barn. The inside of the cabin's no better. The back wall is damp to the touch, where snowdrifts piled high and moisture seeped through the chinking. Some of the logs are soft. Mould is trying to make its debut in the corner, and you don't have enough lye to chase it out. You scrape it away with a knife, muttering under your breath. The boy watches from his blanket pile, now well enough to make snide remarks about your carpenter skills. You let him. Sarcasm means he's healing. The floor? Warped. Not all of it, just enough to make you trip every 5th step. One of the joists cracked during the blizzard. You know it. You heard it. And now, when you step in the wrong place, the plank gives just enough to remind you how thin the line is between house and hole. Outside, the barn didn't make it. Not really. The roof collapsed inward, smothering the feed barrels and what was left of the oats. The doors twisted, the hinges ripped free. You managed to pull the tools out: a half-frozen shovel, a rusted hoe, a sack of nails that's now mostly just a sack. The chickens, mercifully, were already gone before the storm. You don't ask about the rest. What's done is done. Quirky historical fact. Some pioneers didn't bother rebuilding every year, they just moved. Left the sagging structures where they stood and walked a few miles down the trail to start over. Easier, they said, than trying to resurrect something winter had already claimed. You think about that now, about leaving this place, walking until you find ground that doesn't remember your footprints or your failures.
But you won't. Not yet. Instead, you turn to the spring tasks that frontier families used to dream about in the middle of the longest nights: repairing, planting, drying out what's salvageable. You dig shallow trenches around the cabin to guide the meltwater away from the foundation. You stack the usable firewood and burn the rest, just to clear space. You rebuild the fence posts that were flattened by snowdrifts or chewed by bored goats in early December. You even patch the outhouse roof because some things, while not glamorous, are absolutely essential. And while you do all this, the land begins to shift. It's subtle at first. A trickle of water down the hill where there used to be a snowbank. A single bird call echoing through the woods. A breeze that carries smell instead of just cold. You catch it as you walk past the edge of the clearing. Wet bark, thawing earth, the sour tang of decomposing leaves. It's not pleasant, but it's not winter. And that's enough to make your chest ache with relief. You've seen neighbors' places during the thaw, those who didn't make it. Cabins half sunken, doors hanging open, snowdrift curling into the doorway like a white tongue. Sometimes there were signs, collapsed fences, broken tools, empty pens. Sometimes silence. And when people finally re-emerged, they took note. Who was still alive? Who needed help? Who didn't make it to spring? That's part of rebuilding too. Community. Checking on the others. Trading. Helping. Lending what you can spare. You think about heading to the trading post tomorrow, seeing if the roof held through the storm, if the others you saw before the blizzard are still breathing. You'll bring what you can. Maybe some dried roots, the last of the squirrel jerky, or just news. Out here, information is almost as valuable as flour. Scholars often debate the long-term toll of repeated winters on frontier families, not just physically, but mentally. Seasonal depression wasn't a diagnosis back then, but it was real. Cabin fever, melancholia, the winter blues. Whatever you called it, it crept in through the same cracks you'd just sealed against the wind. But rebuilding, that did something. Hammering boards, turning the soil, watching meltwater run off instead of in. It reminded people that forward was still a direction. You sit back on the porch now, a cracked mug of something warm in your hands, and look over your lopsided kingdom. It's patched, smoky, muddy, and slumped in places, but it's standing. And in the Wild West, after a winter like the one you just crawled through, that makes it a palace. Behind you, the boy is humming a tune you don't recognize. It might be made up. It doesn't matter. Music is another kind of rebuild. The sky is softening overhead. Somewhere in the trees, the first mosquito of the season probably just hatched, because of course it did. Spring is coming, which means the Cold War is over, for now. But peace doesn't mean you stop moving. It means you pick up a hammer, dig your hands into the warming earth, and start building again. Because survival isn't just not dying. It's living on purpose, even when everything around you keeps trying to fall apart. The thaw isn't smooth. It never is. One day, the snow's crust still crunches under your boots like brittle glass, and the next, your foot plunges through it, soaking your sock with icy sludge that smells vaguely like old moss and misery. The icicles that used to hang like fangs from the roof drip steadily now, each drop falling with the drama of a drumbeat, wearing grooves into the muddy ground below. And just when you think winter's finally on its last legs, it sucker punches you with a late-season snow, dumping 3 fresh inches overnight like a parting insult. But that's spring out here. Not a rescue, but a negotiation. You're almost there, though. You can feel it in the air, in the way the breeze carries the scent of rot and earth instead of just cold. In the way the animals come back, slowly, cautiously. A rabbit darts past the edge of the cabin, fat and bold. The crows are louder now, like they've returned from wherever birds go when everything is frozen and mean. And the boy, he's outside for the first time in weeks, face pale but eyes alive, holding a stick like it's a sword and poking at every snowbank in his path. You let him. You'd poke the world with a stick too, if it had kept you locked inside all winter. This is what survival really looks like in the Wild West after a hard winter. Not a grand victory, not a dramatic moment of celebration, just the slow, patient re-entry into a world that nearly forgot you were here. You take stock again, but differently now. Less urgency, more curiosity. What's broken that can't be fixed? What's gone for good? What new thing can you make from the bones of the old? You spend a full day gathering up snapped branches and broken fence slats, sorting them into burn and fix and repurpose piles. Some of the logs from the fallen tree might make decent planks. Others might just be tomorrow's cooking fuel. You're finally back to the point where you can plan for more than just making it through the night. One of the first things you do? Plant something. Not because it'll feed you today or even next week, but because you need to remind yourself that the earth still knows how to give. You find the softest patch of ground, dig it with a stick in your bare hands, and drop in a few old seeds from the pouch you almost forgot you had. Beans, maybe squash. You're not even sure they're still good. Doesn't matter. It's the act of it. The hope buried under dirt. Historically, that was always the moment you could tell who made it. They started planting, even before the last snow melted, sometimes in the snow. Settlers would scratch rows into the edge of a thawed clearing, scatter whatever seeds they had, and hope the soil would remember how to work. They planted gardens on the graves of those who hadn't made it through the winter, sometimes literally. It wasn't morbid, it was practical, and it was the most stubborn form of faith. You also fixed the trap line, not because you need furs now, but because it's part of the rhythm. The traps rusted during the blizzard. You clean them, reset them, walk the line slowly, pausing at each marker like a ritual. You haven't seen many tracks yet, but you will. The forest always wakes up late, and when it does, you'll be ready. Inside the cabin, things start to shift too. The thick layers of winter, blankets over doors, rags stuffed in cracks, snow piled against the outer wall, come off, one by one. Carefully. You open the window for the first time, and for a second the air feels too big, like you've punched a hole in your own world. But then the breeze drifts in, rich with mud and leaf and sky, and you let it stay. The fire still burns, but less. You let it go out during the day sometimes. Bold, foolish, beautiful decision. You sit by the hearth anyway, not because it's needed, but because it still feels like the heart of the place. You sip from a cup of hot water. Not tea, not broth, just warmth. It's the luxury of not needing it to survive. Quirky historical note. Some settlers used to throw a little party on the first day. They didn't have to light the stove in the morning. They'd bake something if they could, or just make coffee and drink it on the porch, watching the snow drip off the eaves like the end credits of a very long movie. Kids would strip off their coats and run wild for the first time in months, half feral with joy. Some families even had thaw feasts, cobbled together from whatever hadn't spoiled: pickled carrots, salt pork, stale biscuits made tolerable with jam. You don't have a feast, but you do make biscuits again. Flat, a little burnt on the bottom, but they rise this time. Not because you did anything different, but because the cabin's finally warm enough to let the dough breathe. You eat them with the last of the molasses, and the boy says they taste like not dying, which weirdly is accurate. There's an argument among scholars about what defines the end of winter on the frontier. Is it the first green shoot pushing through thawed ground? The day the woodpile stops shrinking? The return of trade wagons along muddy trails? Maybe it's none of those. Maybe it's this: the moment you breathe easy again, when survival stops being a full-time job and becomes just life. You sit outside that evening, the air cool but soft. The boy's asleep inside, snoring like a saw. The moon's out, pale and enormous, casting silver light over a land that tried very hard to kill you and failed. Somewhere in the woods, a fox barks once, sharp and sudden. You listen, not for danger, just to hear something alive that isn't you. You've spent months thinking about shelters, how to build them, how to seal them, how to huddle inside and hope they don't fail. But now, for the first time in a long while, you look at the world outside the shelter and realize you're still here, upright, breathing, capable of rebuilding whatever broke. Not because you had perfect tools or a perfect plan, but because you endured. One bad biscuit, one packed snow wall, one fire-tending shift at a time. You don't know what next winter will bring. Maybe more snow, maybe better supplies, maybe nothing at all. But that's not tonight's problem. Tonight, you have warmth, stillness, and sky. And sometimes that's all the shelter you need. So now, here we are. 30 sections later, a few thousand logs burned, a couple blizzards survived, and maybe a mild case of frostbite successfully dodged. You're still upright, a little weather-beaten, sure, but wiser, calmer, stronger in that quiet, unshiny kind of way people don't write songs about but probably should. Looking back over these long, cold nights, you've built more than just walls and roofs. You've built resilience. You've seen how survival in the Wild West winter wasn't just a matter of throwing up a log cabin and hoping for the best. It was layer after layer of grit, instinct, borrowed wisdom, and a whole lot of stubbornness. You dug through ice for water. You patched every leak with whatever wasn't frozen solid. You leaned on neighbors when there were neighbors, and leaned on silence when there weren't. And even when the wind screamed like it had a personal vendetta, you stayed inside. You stayed warm. You stayed alive. Every creak in the cabin walls told a story. Every trip to the frozen creek, every biscuit that crumbled like regret, every fire that nearly got out of control, it all counted. That's the thing about surviving a winter like that. It's not one grand moment of victory. It's 1,000 tiny choices not to quit. And now, you've earned this calm. The storm's passed, the light's coming back. Somewhere out there, the trees are shaking off the snow, and the trails are opening. The danger's not gone, but it's different now. Less suffocating, more like background noise. You've earned rest, the good kind, not the collapsed on the floor because you haven't slept in a week kind, the kind where the fire's just right, the blanket's heavy, and your muscles ache in that way that says you made it. So lean back. Take one last look at the log walls, the cracked window, the kettle hissing softly over the coals. The work never ends out here. But for tonight, it can wait.